In the opening line of the Bible, everything begins with a calm, definitive statement. God created the heavens and the earth. One sentence, simple, direct, and powerful enough to set the entire scriptural story in motion. But what if that famous beginning is only the doorway? What if, somewhere in the shadows of ancient history, there survived a companion account, an older, stranger retelling that expands the creation story, with details Genesis never pauses to explain? That's where our journey takes us tonight, into the Book of Jubilees, a little-known ancient text that reads like a hidden prelude to the biblical world. Jubilees doesn't merely repeat Genesis, it reframes it. It offers a universe packed with structure, hierarchy, and cosmic record-keeping. It describes how heaven is organized, when angels were brought into being, and what unseen events unfolded before Adam ever opened his eyes. Whether you view it as sacred, symbolic, or historically fascinating, the text feels like stepping into an alternate lens, one where time itself is engineered, where spiritual beings shape the edges of human history, and where creation is not only an act of power, but the installation of a divine system. And before we go deeper, if this kind of ancient late-night exploration is the sort of content that helps you unwind, consider liking and subscribing so we can keep building these evenings together. Also, I'd genuinely love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. All right, let's begin. The manuscript that shouldn't exist. Imagine a text that nearly vanished from the world. In caves near the Dead Sea, sealed away in silence and darkness for close to 2 millennia, ancient scrolls lay hidden, while empires rose and collapsed above them. Then, in the modern era, those caves gave up their secrets. Among the writings recovered from that region were fragments and copies of a work most people in the West had barely heard of, a book that had slipped out of mainstream awareness for centuries. That book is Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis. And its premise is bold. It retells early biblical history, especially the creation and patriarchal narratives, as though it contains the fuller version of events, an inside account, preserved from a deeper archive than the one most readers know. In Jubilees, angels aren't occasional visitors. They are constant presences, observers, messengers, guardians, scribes. The world doesn't drift along casually through time. It moves according to a strict sacred rhythm, patterns of sevens, cycles of weeks and years, like reality is being kept on an invisible schedule. Even the calendar isn't a human convention in this text. Jubilees presents a heavenly system of time that, according to its author, governs sacred order on earth. And this isn't a modern invention or a fictional add-on written for entertainment. Jubilees was known in antiquity, cherished by certain communities, copied and preserved with care, and echoed in the imagination of people who believed the universe ran on far more than what the eye could see. For more than 500 years, it faded from Western religious life, yet it did not completely disappear. Ethiopian Christian tradition preserved it as scripture, reading it alongside Genesis and Exodus, while much of the wider world forgot it existed at all. Now, with the rediscovery and study of ancient manuscripts, especially those associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jubilees has become readable again, and what it reveals is both unsettling and captivating. Open its pages, and you step into a world where Moses is not simply given laws on a mountain, but is also handed a sweeping cosmic history. You enter a reality where Enoch isn't just a mysterious figure who walked with God, but someone taught celestial knowledge by beings from above. You enter a universe where spiritual forces have names, roles, limitations, and assignments. It's a worldview built on order, divine structure, divine administration, divine timing. Human beings still make choices, but those choices unfold inside a framework that already exists, like a play staged on a set, designed before the actors ever arrive. In Jubilees, the universe does not merely happen, it runs. Who wrote it, and why did it disappear? Scholars generally place the composition of Jubilees in the 2nd century BCE, a period when Jewish communities were navigating intense cultural pressure under Hellenistic influence. That era involved real questions of identity, how to preserve tradition, how to resist assimilation, and how to remain faithful in a world that kept demanding compromise. The author remains unknown, but the book speaks with remarkable confidence. It presents itself as something ancient, something revealed, not invented. It suggests that the history it contains is not merely storytelling, but knowledge delivered from heaven itself. And that claim, while compelling to some communities, also made Jubilees controversial, because if the book is right, then many people, many traditions, are practicing time, worship, and obedience incorrectly. One of the most striking examples is its insistence on a fixed 3-6-4 day calendar, a perfectly symmetrical year of 52 weeks, designed so sacred festivals never drift through the seasons. No leap years, no adjustments, no flexibility. The calendar is presented not as a recommendation, but as the correct heavenly pattern. That rigidity helps explain why Jubilees struggled to remain central as religious communities evolved. Traditions that needed room to interpret, adapt, and grow found the book's uncompromising framework difficult to absorb. Over time, most Jewish authorities did not include it in the developing scriptural canon. Many Christian communities, shaping their own collections of sacred texts, also set it aside, partly because its heavy emphasis on detailed law and cosmic administration didn't fit neatly into how they were defining doctrine and identity. And yet, despite being excluded from most mainstream Bibles, the book refused to vanish completely. Its themes echoed in the thought world of certain ancient groups, including communities connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Its angelology and spiritual vocabulary resonated across centuries of Near Eastern folklore. Even in early Christian writing, traces of its influence can be felt not always by direct quotation, but through shared assumptions about angels, cosmic records, and spiritual warfare. So today, Jubilees returns not as a universally accepted scripture, but as an ancient voice, one that preserves a remarkably different way of seeing reality. A universe where time is sacred architecture. If Genesis opens with creation as a dramatic sequence of divine acts, Jubilees opens with something equally dramatic but far more structured: history as a schedule. In this book, time is not just passing minutes. Time is a holy framework measured, partitioned, and counted in repeating patterns. Jubilees divides history into precise units, cycles built around sevens, culminating in Jubilee periods that shape how events are remembered and understood. The implication is clear. Nothing in history is random. Everything fits. Everything lands where it is supposed to land. And behind this structure are the heavenly tablets, cosmic records maintained by angels. These tablets don't simply preserve the past. They represent a divine archive where the storyline of creation has already been inscribed. Events unfold on earth, but they are documented, some would say authorized, in heaven. This makes the book feel almost like a revelation of hidden mechanics. Births, deaths, covenants, conflicts, migrations, everything is presented as part of a mapped design. Human choice still matters, but the stage is already built, the calendar already fixed, the order already established. Genesis, but expanded sometimes uncomfortably. Jubilees also does something else. It retells familiar stories and fills in gaps with extra detail. It gives motivations. It adds conversations. It supplies names and explanations the biblical text leaves unstated. The effect can be mesmerizing, like hearing a story you grew up with, but told by someone who insists they know what happened between the lines. Angels appear at the beginning, not as later messengers, but as participants in creation itself. Spiritual beings oversee aspects of the natural world. Judgment and instruction often occur through angelic administration. And one figure emerges with particular intensity: Mastema, a character who resembles Satan in function, yet operates more like a prosecuting force within the divine court, testing, accusing, troubling humanity, but only within limits permitted by God. In Jubilees, evil is not portrayed as an equal rival to God. It is more like a controlled opposition, dangerous, real, and destructive, yet constrained. Even the darkness has rules. Moses on the mountain receiving more than law. Jubilees frames its entire narrative through a dramatic scene, Moses ascending Mount Sinai. You may know the story from Exodus: thunder, cloud, covenant, commandments. But Jubilees claims something additional occurred there. According to this text, Moses is approached by a heavenly messenger, often described as the angel of the presence, who instructs him to write down a revelation far larger than legal code. Moses is shown history itself, laid out from creation onward, as though he is being read the master record from the heavenly archive. And central to what he receives is not only moral instruction, but cosmic alignment, the correct calendar, the correct structure of time, the pattern heaven recognizes. The warning is sharp. If human beings adopt other systems, especially lunar patterns that shift festivals across seasons, they risk falling out of sync with sacred order. Worship offered on the wrong day becomes, in this worldview, misdirected worship. Time is not neutral. Time is obedience. So Moses remains on the mountain, not only as a lawgiver, but as a scribe of sacred history, recording a story that claims to explain the world's true design. Creation reimagined as a heavenly administration. Now we come to one of Jubilee's most vivid features, its version of creation. Genesis can feel like a majestic solitude, God speaking light into existence, shaping the cosmos by command. Jubilees, by contrast, depicts creation as an event witnessed by a populated heaven. From the earliest moments, spiritual beings exist. The unseen realm is not empty. It is organized. In this telling, the first day is not only the formation of heaven and earth, but the bringing into existence of spiritual orders, angels assigned to different aspects of reality, forces of nature, and the maintenance of creation's balance. The world is not merely made, it is staffed, it is governed. Creation unfolds across days much as it does in Genesis, but with added emphasis on cosmic oversight. Each act is part of an installed system, divine mechanics set in place, with spiritual beings recording, executing, and maintaining the order established at the beginning. And that is the feeling Jubilees gives again and again. Not simply that God made the world, but that God built a universe with layers, with records, with structure, and with time as one of the most sacred components of all. If Genesis is the opening line, Jubilees claims to be the blueprint hidden behind it. A book that insists the beginning was never simple, never quiet, and never unobserved. On the first day, Jubilees says God creates more than light. He establishes a populated heaven, angels brought into existence, and organized immediately into ranks, duties, and jurisdictions. Some remain nearest the throne, their role pure worship, standing before the divine presence in continual praise. Others move as messengers, carrying commands between realms. Still others are assigned to the machinery of the world itself, overseeing what humans later call nature. Wind and rain, seasons and storms, the motion of the stars, the shifting of heat and cold. Creation, in this telling, isn't only a masterpiece, it's an administration. From the first moment, heaven is staffed. Day 2 follows Genesis in the separation of waters, but Jubilees insists this separation is not left unattended. Spiritual overseers are appointed, as though even the boundaries between above and below require guardianship to hold them in place. On day 3, when land rises and the earth begins to take shape, more angelic roles appear. Record keepers, watchers, supervisors assigned to the developing world, like officials posted to every new province of a growing kingdom. The message is constant. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is unsupervised. Nothing is outside the gaze of the heavenly court. Then the 4th day arrives, and Jubilees adds what it treats as the essential key to the entire created order, the calendar. When God places the sun, moon, and stars in the sky, the text pushes beyond simple astronomy. The lights above are not merely markers of day and night, they are instruments of divine timing. The sun's path becomes the visible track of a sacred schedule, a heavenly blueprint measured in a perfect year of 364 days, arranged so precisely that weeks never fracture and holy days never drift. Time is portrayed as something God built into the world, like a law of gravity, a structure meant to keep worship aligned with heaven rather than with human preference. The angel explaining these matters to Moses makes it sound less like a convenience and more like a command. The lights were set for days, Sabbaths, months, feast times, jubilees, and seasons. In other words, every unit of time carries meaning. To ignore that order is not simply to be careless with dates. It is to step out of sync with the rhythm creation was designed to follow. Days 5 and 6 bring the creatures of sea, sky, and land, but Jubilees cannot resist adding symbolism. It emphasizes that 22 kinds of creatures were formed, an echo of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, as if the world itself is structured like sacred language, as if creation is a kind of living scripture written into matter. And finally, humanity appears, Adam shaped from the earth, animated by God's breath. Yet Jubilees doesn't present this moment as the quiet arrival of a garden caretaker. It frames the creation of humans as an event that provokes reaction in heaven. Some angels rejoice, but others are uneasy, and that unease foreshadows conflict, resentment that will later surface in darker ways, as though the placement of humanity at the center of the earthly realm immediately creates tension within the spiritual hierarchy. Even Eve's creation is treated with careful sequencing. Jubilees stresses she is not formed alongside Adam in the same instant, but after Adam is brought into Eden. It's a small shift in chronology, yet it signals something larger about how the author sees roles, order, and relational structure. The timing becomes theology. The narrative implies that even human relationships are part of the same cosmic architecture that organizes angels, seasons, and sacred time. When the seventh day comes, Jubilees intensifies the meaning of God's rest. The Sabbath is not presented as a pause for recovery, as though God needed to breathe, but as the creation of something new, holy time itself, the crown placed on the week like a seal of divine completion. And then the book makes a startling claim. This day, in its full sanctity, belongs to only two groups, the angels in heaven and Israel on earth. In that assertion, Jubilees reveals its deeper agenda. The world's order is universal, but covenant identity is particular. Sabbath becomes not only a rhythm of rest, but a boundary marker of belonging. So by the time Jubilees finishes its creation sequence, the reader is standing in a universe far more layered than the one most people imagine from Genesis alone. It is a world designed with precision, managed by spiritual beings, governed by sacred timing, and watched over by invisible witnesses who record history as it unfolds. Human beings may have free will, but they do not stand alone. They move inside a system already active, already structured, already logged in heaven. And Eden itself in Jubilees is not merely a paradise. It functions like a sanctuary. Adam and Eve are not placed there simply to enjoy beauty or harvest fruit. They are placed there to serve, to offer incense, to worship. The garden becomes a prototype temple, and humanity's original role is not just cultivation, but communion, tending the earth while maintaining reverence for the one who designed its order. The fall, told with the weight of a cosmic trial. When Jubilees reaches the temptation, it pulls the scene into a deeper, darker dimension. The serpent appears as in Genesis, but Jubilees insists the serpent is not the true author of the event. Behind it stands a spiritual intelligence, Mastema, the prince of hostile spirits, a kind of prosecutor within the divine court. The temptation, then, is not random curiosity. It is a measured test, a universal trial to see whether human beings will remain aligned with heaven's order or fracture the boundaries God established. Eve's choice follows the familiar path, the fruit, the bite, the sharing with Adam. But Jubilees interprets the act less as isolated disobedience and more as contamination, a violation of sacred boundaries. The shift in awareness is portrayed as a disturbing awakening. Their nakedness is not only embarrassment, it is the loss of a former dignity, a glory that once covered them. The angel's narration emphasizes the moment their eyes open, as if something inside them breaks, and something else, something heavier, moves in. Then God arrives, and Jubilees makes the encounter anything but gentle. The divine presence comes with force, earth trembling, judgment pronounced as though the entire creation shudders under the weight of what has happened. The verdict lands in order: serpent, woman, man, each receiving consequences fitted to their part in the breach. Even the detail of clothing becomes layered with meaning. Jubilees echoes the statement that God clothed them with garments of skin, but ancient readers often heard more than fabric in that phrase. Some understood it as a transformation, not merely dressed bodies, but bodies changed mortal flesh, replacing a former, brighter state, life now tied to decay. And then Jubilees gives what Genesis does not: a precise timeline. Adam and Eve are said to remain in Eden for 7 years, 1 week of years, before their expulsion. Paradise, in other words, is not lost on day 1. It is lost after a measured season. Even exile happens on schedule. When they leave, Adam carries incense and seed symbols that the original purpose is not entirely erased. Worship continues, though now at a distance. Cultivation continues, though now with sweat and struggle. But the separation is real. Sin becomes a barrier, a rupture between earth and the immediacy of divine holiness. Heaven does not vanish, yet it is no longer directly accessible. Humanity enters a world where survival requires skill, clothing, farming, fire, labor, and Jubilees even suggests that angels, in mercy, instruct them in what they must learn to endure outside the garden. And through it all, time tightens around human life. Days become counts, weeks become segments, years become measures. The clock begins to feel like a sentence and a guide at the same time, an order that continues despite exile. Cain and Abel, the first violence recorded in heaven. Outside Eden, history accelerates. Jubilees gives names, dates, and sequences, as though it is determined to show that even tragedy follows the structure written on the heavenly tablets. Cain is born, then Abel, each arriving within Jubilees' calculated rhythm of weeks and Jubilees. They grow into their roles: Cain tied to the soil, Abel tied to the flock, and when the time of offering comes, the conflict ignites. Jubilees paints the moment with symbolic weight. Abel's offering rises cleanly, Cain's does not. And the story becomes not merely a family rupture, but the first outbreak of human violence. The first time death spreads from the sentence of Eden into the hands of a brother. Jubilees even supplies ages, emphasizing that this is not childish impulsiveness, but grown resentment, cultivated like a weed. Cain leads Abel into the field, away from oversight, away from community, and strikes him down. Blood enters the soil, and the earth becomes a witness. God's question echoes the familiar line: "Where is your brother?" But in Jubilees, the scene feels less like an investigation and more like a formal reckoning. Abel's blood speaks, and heaven already knows. The tablets already hold the record. Cain is marked cursed and protected at once, and then comes another ominous milestone: the first city. Jubilees treats city building with a shadow of suspicion, as if the earliest human attempt to construct civilization is also the earliest attempt to build life apart from the divine pattern. It is shelter, yes, but also independence, a kingdom shaped by human hands after a crime that reshaped history. Meanwhile, the line of Seth becomes the thread of hope, the possibility of remembrance of sacred order, sacred time, and covenant alignment. Yet Jubilees refuses to romanticize the world after Eden. It portrays human life as something now measured in grief. Even mourning becomes counted in Jubilees, as though time itself has become the language of loss. And still the angels watch, still the records are kept, still nothing is random. Even the first murder, in this worldview, is not a loose accident in a chaotic world. It is a dated event, placed within the structure of history, observed by heaven, folded into the long unfolding account of exile, rebellion, mercy, and eventual restoration. The calendar kept turning. The Jubilees kept stacking, cycle after cycle, like gears clicking forward inside a machine that never sleeps. And above it all, the angels kept writing every birth, every harvest, every corruption, every mercy pressed into the heavenly record, as if history itself were ink, Then, in the seventh generation from Adam, a man arrives who doesn't merely live inside time, he learns to read it. His name is Enoch, and Jubilees treats him like a hinge in the story, one of those rare figures who changes what it even means to be human. The book pins his birth to sacred mathematics, as though his life was scheduled from the beginning. Born in a precise week inside a precise Jubilee, his existence already folded into the pattern heaven set at creation. Genesis gives him only a handful of lines, the kind of brief mention that feels almost like a mystery. But Jubilees refuses to leave him as a silhouette. It pulls him forward into full light and makes him something astonishing, the first person to decode the sky. Enoch is not portrayed as holy merely because he behaves well. He is holy because he aligns himself with the architecture of creation. The text insists that while other people were drifting, marking months by unreliable moons, letting festivals slide, letting sacred rhythm blur, Enoch was learning the true timing that heaven runs on. At 12, he begins to fear God. By the time he reaches maturity, the heavens have become his classroom. Angels instruct him, not in vague spiritual impressions, but in the structure of time, how days lock into weeks, how seasons rotate, how lights above keep an unbroken schedule. And the way Jubilees frames it, Enoch isn't just watching stars, he's reading them like scripture. He becomes the first astronomer priest, the first human who can look upward and understand that the sky is not decoration, but governance. The stars turn overhead, and he knows their order. The seasons shift, and he recognizes their appointed boundaries. Before him, time moves like a river with no witness. After him, the river has a keeper. Jubilees even credits him with the beginnings of writing knowledge, wisdom. Records like humanity finally receives the tools to preserve what heaven has been saying all along. For centuries, he walks among his people, teaching them the pattern of days. Not merely telling stories, but pressing order back into a world that's already starting to warp. In Jubilees, this matters because corruption isn't only moral, it's also calendrical. It's misalignment. It's humanity forgetting heaven's rhythm and inventing its own. And here the book gives Enoch a sharper edge than most readers expect. His role isn't only to teach, it's to resist. Jubilees presents him as the human answer to a spiritual crisis. Fallen angels introducing forbidden knowledge, disordered power, skills and secrets arriving too soon, without wisdom or restraint. Where others chase vanity and violence, Enoch teaches truth and timing. In a world learning the wrong kind of mastery, he embodies the right kind, the mastery of alignment. Then comes the moment that makes Enoch unforgettable, the end of his earthly years. Jubilees lingers on the number with a kind of reverence, 365, a life length that mirrors the count of days in the year, as though his story is designed to rhyme with the calendar itself. And unlike everyone before and after, he does not die. He is taken, not as escape, but as transfer, like the earth releases him to the sky he had been studying with such devotion. The one who walked with God now walks with God in the realm he had only mapped from below. Jubilees goes even further, saying the angels bring him into Eden itself, not as a resident in innocence, but as an official in service. Enoch becomes heaven's scribe. He records human deeds, sins and virtues, obedience and rebellion, logged with the same precision he once used to mark seasons. The man who measured time becomes, in a sense, timeless, standing outside the river while still counting its flow. Before he leaves the earth, he warns his son Methuselah, judgment is coming. Water will rise, the world will be cleansed. And Jubilees makes the warning feel less like prophecy and more like schedule, as if the flood is already written into the tablets, already stamped with a date long before the first cloud thickens. That is why Enoch feels so central in this book. He is Jubilees' ideal human, the one who keeps the correct calendar, honors the sacred rhythm, and lives in harmony with the system heaven established at the beginning. He is both scientist and mystic, counting stars while speaking with angels, studying patterns while serving divine purpose. In a text obsessed with exact dates and ordered cycles, Enoch is the one who gets it right. And because he aligns himself with heaven's timing, he escapes time's harshest consequence, death. But his departure creates a vacuum. After Enoch, the knowledge begins to fade. People forget the right calendar. Festivals slip. Seasons lose their sacred boundaries. The gap between heaven and earth stretches wider with every passing Jubilee. Yet, Jubilees insists, Enoch still watches. From the garden, from the place of holiness, he continues to record. The first great timekeeper becomes the keeper of time for everyone else. And while Enoch writes, the world below unravels. By the time the story reaches Noah, Jubilees depicts humanity as more than sinful humanity is out of order. The carefully designed timetable is still ticking, but what's happening inside it has turned foul. Corruption spreads, not just through human choices, but through a breach in the spiritual realm itself. Angels called watchers abandon their assigned roles, descend, and take human wives. Their children are giants, violent, consuming, devouring the world as if creation itself is prey. And the fallen angels teach knowledge that wasn't meant to arrive yet. Metalwork turned into weaponcraft, cosmetics turned into deception, spells turned into domination, star knowledge turned into manipulation instead of worship. The problem isn't simply that humans learn things. It's that the learning comes too early, too fast, detached from holiness. The timetable is being forced. The rhythm is being broken. Noah stands almost alone inside that collapse called righteous, whole in his ways, a rare point of alignment in a world that has drifted. And when he reaches the appointed age, when the tablets say it's time, God speaks, the flood is coming. Not as impulsive fury, but as cleansing, scheduled within the same ordered universe that set the lights in the sky. Jubilees adds a chilling layer while the ark is being built. Demonic forces under Mastema's command accelerate their corruption. They know the window is closing. They press harder as judgment approaches, like parasites panicking when the fire is lit. In that atmosphere, the ark becomes more than survival. It becomes a moving sanctuary, a floating temple built to exact measurements. 3 levels, a single entrance, nothing improvised, every cubit in its place. In a world that has become wrong, the ark stands as something precisely right. Animals enter not at random, but in ordered categories. Pairs, sevens, clean distinctions carefully maintained, because for Jubilees, divine law doesn't vanish during catastrophe. Order is not suspended when the world breaks. It is what saves what remains. And then the date arrives. On the 17th day of the 2nd month, in the 600th year of Noah's life, the waters begin. Rain from above, fountains from below, heaven and earth acting together to wash away what has rotted. Jubilees tracks the flood with almost liturgical precision, days rising, days holding, days receding, because the author wants you to feel the point. This is not chaos. This is timed cleansing. A year inside the ark is not just waiting. It is living inside divine chronology while the world is reset. When the ark finally opens and Noah steps onto clean earth, the story doesn't present evil as permanently erased. It presents evil as restrained. Jubilees says the fallen angels are bound in judgment, but Mastema pleads to keep a portion of spirits active, arguing that humans must still be tested, still be sifted. And in one of the book's strangest, most unsettling turns, God permits it, evil remains, but measured, limited, held on a leash. Not free reign, not total elimination, controlled opposition within the larger plan. Noah responds the way Jubilees loves to emphasize. With worship, he builds an altar. He offers clean sacrifice. Smoke rises straight, accepted an echo that reverses Cain's failure long ago. And then comes covenant, a promise that water will not again be used to erase the earth. A new world begins, not as random continuation, but as the next scheduled movement in the long, counted story, Jubilee after Jubilee, under the watch of angels who never stop recording. Jubilees insists the flood didn't end with survival alone. It ended with restoration, not just of land, but of alignment. Alongside the covenant and the rainbow, God is portrayed as re-establishing what had been slipping since Enoch's era, the authentic calendar. A year measured in 364 days, cleanly divided into full weeks and balanced seasons, so sacred time never drifts and worship never loses its appointed rhythm. The world begins again, washed clean, but not perfected. Corruption has been cut back, not erased. And time resumes its march with a new sign hanging in the sky. A rainbow that doesn't just promise restraint, but announces something more chilling in Jubilee's worldview. Judgment is never random. The flood came exactly when heaven scheduled it. Whatever comes later will arrive on schedule too. The waters retreat, the ground hardens, and Noah steps into the new world like the first man of a second creation. His first act is worship an altar, a sacrifice, smoke rising the way it was always meant to rise. Then he turns to cultivation. He plants a vineyard, and Jubilees narrows its focus like a camera zooming in, fixing the moment in time with the same obsession it applies to everything else. The vine grows quickly in soil, churned and enriched by catastrophe. Grapes swell, wine is made. But Noah, righteous as he is, does not fully understand what he has produced. He drinks, becomes uncovered, and falls asleep in his tent. What follows is one of Scripture's strangest episodes, and Jubilees refuses to let it remain vague. Ham sees his father's nakedness and goes outside to tell his brothers. Shem and Japheth respond differently. They walk backward, holding a garment between them like a shield, refusing even to look as they cover their father and restore his dignity. When Noah wakes and learns what happened, the curse erupts, but it lands on Canaan, Ham's son, not on Ham himself. Genesis leaves readers staring at the gap, trying to understand why a grandson receives the sentence. Jubilees offers its explanation by reframing the event as more than accidental shame. It becomes a violation of sacred boundaries, a failure to honor the order of family and holiness. And Jubilees adds a detail that sharpens the consequence into something almost political. Noah, the text says, had already divided land among his sons. Boundaries had been set, portions had been assigned. The world was being structured again, the way creation itself was structured by allotment, by borders, by proper order. That means the sin isn't just that Ham saw. It's that the breach happens after the division, after the sacred arrangement of inheritance is already in motion. Nothing can be rearranged without unraveling the entire plan. So the curse doesn't undo the map, but it brands a line within it. Canaan becomes marked for servitude, a permanent consequence inside an already established structure. Relationships fracture, even as geography holds. Jubilees then does what it loves most. It turns the story into a timeline with coordinates. It describes the spread of Noah's family with geographic precision. Shem receiving the central portion, a land that will later matter intensely to Israel's identity. Ham receiving the hotter southern regions. Japheth taking the cooler northern expanses. Each son swears to respect the boundaries, but oaths don't hold forever. Canaan looks toward regions like Lebanon and the Jordan corridor, and chooses to settle there despite the allotment. And Jubilees repeats the curse, like a refrain, not merely because of an old family scandal, but because Canaan's descendants are portrayed as living where they should not be living. That's the point the original readers would have felt in their bones. Jubilees isn't only telling ancient history, it's arguing that present conflict has roots in divine decree. The enemies surrounding Israel are not simply rivals. They are, in this logic, trespassers, people inhabiting land that heaven's map assigned elsewhere. The story becomes a cosmic land deed, a theological justification written backward into primeval time. Noah lives on centuries. According to the book, his lifespan measured not casually in years, but in jubilees and weeks and counted segments, as though his life itself is a proof of the system. Before his death, Jubilees adds warnings. Genesis doesn't emphasize the same way. Avoid blood, avoid contamination, avoid mixing what should remain distinct. The theme is consistent. Holiness is the maintenance of boundaries. Corruption begins when categories blur between clean and unclean, between allotted lands, between spiritual order and human appetite. The world fills again. Cities rise, nations begin to form. A new chapter of history starts ticking forward, and Jubilees wants you to feel the relentless rhythm behind it. Even disaster has timing. Even curses unfold within schedule. The angels keep watching. The tablets keep recording. The clock keeps moving toward the next major turning point. And that turning point arrives not with water, but with brick. 3 generations after Noah, humanity gathers in Shinar with one language and one purpose. They decide to build a city and a tower, reaching to heaven. A structure that sounds like pride in Genesis, but feels in Jubilees like fear disguised as ambition. The flood is in their memory. God has promised restraint, yes, but humans don't heal easily. Jubilees interprets the project as an attempt to create security that cannot be washed away. They bake bricks. They use binding materials designed to resist water. They build upward as if height itself could outsmart judgment. God descends to observe, and Jubilees frames what happens next, not as impulsive fury, but as cosmic reordering. The time has come for humanity to scatter across the earth as originally intended. So the single language fractures, communication splinters, and Jubilees stamps the moment with a date. In the beginning of a specific Jubilee cycle, the confusion begins. But the division is not random chaos. It is structured because Jubilees cannot imagine heaven acting without structure. The nations separate into 70 peoples, matching 70 angelic rulers assigned over them. Lots are cast, territories are apportioned, languages are distributed, borders are marked. The tower stops mid-rise. Babel becomes the scar of an unfinished human dream, and the people scatter outward in every direction, east and west, north and south, like seeds flung from a single plant. And then Jubilees adds its most decisive twist. Among all these angelic allotments, one portion is treated differently. One line is held back. One inheritance is not handed to an angelic governor at all. The Most High keeps it. A 71st portion directly ruled, directly guided, preserved through Shem's descendants, through Arpachshad, toward the figure the entire timetable has been counting down toward, Abraham. So Babel isn't merely the story of language confusion. In Jubilees, it's the moment humanity is divided under heavenly administration, the moment nations receive both territory and spiritual oversight, and the moment God quietly sets aside one bloodline as a direct covenant channel, one people who will be measured, tested, disciplined, and protected under the same sacred clock that began at creation and was restored after the flood. The tower falls silent, unfinished. The world becomes multilingual overnight. And history continues, counted, watched, recorded, moving toward the next scheduled call, the next covenant, the next rupture, the next mercy. Jubilees doesn't stop at the confusion of languages. It sharpens the moment into something far more unsettling, because in this book, Babel isn't only a human failure, it becomes an angelic betrayal. After the nations fracture, Jubilees says most of the angelic rulers assigned over the peoples begin to drift. Instead of guiding their portions toward the Most High, they guide them away. They teach their nations to carve images, to offer the wrong sacrifices, to adopt the wrong measures of time. The 70 guardians become 70 tempters. A spiritual bureaucracy meant to preserve order turns into a network of misdirection, and the earth fills with counterfeit worship that looks religious on the surface but is out of alignment with heaven's design. Only one portion remains different, the inheritance God keeps for himself. That line, preserved through Shem, holds on, at least for a time, to the correct pattern, the right festivals, the right Sabbaths, the right calendar. A year of 364 days, divided cleanly into full weeks and stable seasons, maintained like a flame in a windstorm, while the rest of the world stumbles into confusion. In Jubilees, the calendar isn't a minor detail. It's a diagnostic tool. To keep divine time is to remain tethered to divine truth. To abandon it is to wander into a fog where worship becomes misdirected, even when it feels sincere. And in that fog, power rises. Nimrod appears Noah's descendant, a figure Genesis describes with a kind of ambiguous grandeur. But Jubilees has no such ambiguity. It portrays Nimrod as the first man to turn organized humanity into organized rebellion. He builds not simply cities, but fortified structures of defiance, walls and borders that contradict heaven's allotments. He teaches warfare as a craft. He turns separated families into competing populations. In a world newly divided by language, he makes division permanent by introducing the politics of conquest, territory claimed by force rather than by divine boundary. So the post-Babel world becomes a patchwork of nations that no longer remember their shared source. Cousin cannot speak to cousin. Brother becomes foreign to brother. Every group is sealed inside its own tongue, its own customs, its own calendar, its own gods. And behind much of it, Jubilees says, are the angelic rulers guiding, shaping, bending nations toward deeper darkness. Authentic knowledge fades. The calendar Enoch read in the heavens, the calendar Noah preserved through catastrophe, survives now in only a narrow stream. Most peoples follow the moon's drift or local star signs used for divination rather than reverence. Timekeeping that feels cosmic but is, in Jubilees' eyes, misaligned with the true pattern. Then the story gives you a date, because Jubilees always gives you a date. Hundreds of years after the flood, deep into the counted cycles, a child is born in Ur of the Chaldeans. His name is Abram, later called Abraham, and the book frames his arrival like the turning of a key. In a world ruled by scattered nations and misleading angels, God begins gathering an answer, a people who might remember heaven's order again. That's why Babel matters so much in Jubilees. It isn't merely punishment for arrogance, it is containment. Humanity tried to reach heaven using its own measurements, unity without a divine center, assent without obedience, ambition without alignment. If all people had remained one, in one language, under one project, Jubilees suggests their corruption would have scaled as high as their tower. Division, then, becomes protection. Evil is localized, limited, fractured. 70 nations under 70 angelic rulers, 70 languages, 70 territories, structured dispersion imposed on human overreach. And through it all, the clock keeps moving. Jubilees continue their relentless count. The world is now a stage of scattered kingdoms, false worship, and distorted time, which makes Abraham's emergence feel less like a personal calling and more like a cosmic rescue operation. God stepping back into the human timeline to preserve the one thread still tied to heaven's rhythm. Abraham, the chosen one of the timekeeper. Jubilees refuses to introduce Abraham as a passive recipient of destiny. It portrays him as awake, while others sleep, someone who can feel the wrongness of the world around him long before he can fully name it. In Ur, Abram grows up watching his father, Terah, fashion idols, figures carved from wood and shaped from clay, objects given names and prayers and fear. But Abram isn't pulled toward them, he is pulled upward. The stars above him don't look like random lights, they look like order, not chaos pattern, not chance design. And in Jubilees, that perception becomes the first tremor of revolution. The book tells the idol-smashing scene with a sharp, almost playful edge, but it isn't written as a joke. Abram takes a hammer and breaks the household gods, leaving only the largest one intact, and placing the hammer in its hand like evidence. When Terah discovers the destruction, he demands an explanation, and Abram's answer is as calm as it is merciless. The big idol did it. Terror explodes because he knows it's impossible. These are lifeless objects. He made them. They cannot act. And Abram's reply lands like a blade. If you know they have no power, why do you worship what your own hands have shaped? In Jubilees, that exchange isn't merely a child's cleverness. It's the first crack in a global system of false worship. Abram isn't just rejecting idols. He's rejecting a world that has lost its center. Then Jubilees connects Abraham's awakening to its central obsession, time. At 14, Abram begins studying the heavens not for omens, not for manipulation, but for the appointed rhythm of creation. While others measure by lunar drift, Abram discovers the stability of the solar year. The book insists is heaven's true measure. 364 days, 4 equal seasons, 13 weeks each, unbroken by wandering months. For Jubilees, This is not astronomy as hobby. It is obedience. It is alignment. It is the recovery of something ancient that most of the world has misplaced. Famine pushes the family toward Haran, and Jubilees portrays Abram maturing there into a teacher rather than a silent believer. He constructs a tower, not a Babel tower of rebellion, but a watchtower of correction, tracking the sun's movement and showing anyone who will listen how sacred time is meant to work. Some mock him, some ignore him, but the text frames it as proof. Abraham is different because he doesn't merely see patterns. He traces patterns back to their source. He recognizes that time itself is a gift and a test. Then comes the call. In the quiet of night, under the same stars he has been measuring, Abram hears the command to leave father's house, homeland, familiarity, and go toward a land God will show him. Jubilees makes that moment feel like more than a journey. It feels like a transfer into a new timeline, a life stepped onto the track heaven designed. As he travels, Jubilees emphasizes what Genesis mentions but doesn't always spotlight. Abraham marks his path with altars. But these aren't only acts of gratitude, they are boundary stones in time. The book suggests the dates matter, the days of feasts, the rhythms written on the tablets, so even Abraham's worship becomes synchronized with the calendar of heaven. When he reaches Canaan, Jubilees frames it not as opportunistic migration, but as cosmic realignment. This land, it argues, belongs by ancient allotment to Shem's line, and Canaan's descendants are portrayed as occupying what was not assigned to them. Abraham's arrival becomes, therefore, more than settlement. It is a reclaiming, walking the borders of a divine contract, putting geography back into the shape heaven intended. And then the story sharpens again, because alignment does not mean a life without conflict. The War of Kings, the night attack, and divine timing. Dust rises as coalitions of kings move against the cities of the plain. Violence rolls across the land like a storm front, swallowing settlements and dragging captives in its wake. Among them is Lot, Abraham's nephew, pulled away, along with everything he owns. A survivor escapes and brings the news. Abraham doesn't hesitate. Genesis gives you the outline: a rescue, a pursuit, a victory. Jubilees leans in and turns it into a portrait of Abraham as heaven's chosen champion, moving not merely with courage but with timing. He gathers trained men, 318, organizes them with precision, and strikes at night. The attack comes sudden and coordinated, a small force falling on larger camps like a desert wind that arrives without warning. And Jubilees frames it the way it frames everything, not as chance, not as luck, not as mere skill. It presents the victory as synchronized events landing at the hour heaven already recorded, as if Abraham's steps are now moving with the same schedule that governs seasons and jubilees. Dawn breaks on a battlefield where the mighty lie scattered, and Lot is brought back alive. Because that is Abraham's function in this book. He is not only a patriarch, he is a corrective. In a world where most nations follow false rulers and false time, Abraham becomes the man through whom God rethreads the calendar, the covenant, and the human story back into alignment. Abraham didn't return from the rescue of Lot empty-handed. He came back carrying the weight of victory, captives freed, enemies scattered, and wealth gathered from the fallen camps. But Jubilees refuses to treat the outcome as ordinary spoils. It claims the triumph landed on a day already loaded with meaning, the exact anniversary of Noah's landing after the flood, a recurring marker in the sacred pattern when divine justice tends to surface in the world. History, in this book, doesn't merely repeat. It echoes dates, becoming spiritual pressure points where heaven's timetable touches the earth. So as Abraham travels home beneath a sky he understands better than any man alive, the road itself becomes a threshold. A figure appears mysterious, sudden, and strangely out of place among kings and merchants. Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Genesis introduces him in a few brief lines, like a door that opens and closes too quickly for the reader to see what's inside. Jubilees holds that door open longer. It paints Melchizedek as more than a local priest-king, almost as if he belongs to a different category of being, a guardian of sacred order, possibly even one of the appointed overseers of the divine timeline. Abraham responds without hesitation. He bows. He offers a tenth of everything he has taken. And in Jubilees, that tenth is not just generosity, it is cosmic recognition. Abraham is acknowledging that the victory did not originate in his strength or his tactics, but in the order that governs history itself. The tithe becomes a kind of submission to heaven's hierarchy, an admission that Abraham's role, though central, is still part of a design far larger than his personal story. Melchizedek blesses him with bread and wine, simple gifts on the surface, but Jubilees refuses to let them remain simple. It links them to sacred seasons, to feasts that will one day carry deep covenant meaning. Bread becomes the sign of harvest and appointed provision. Wine becomes joy in its proper time celebration that belongs inside the calendar rather than outside it. Even this roadside meeting is presented as structured, a full day from sunset to sunset, shaped like a Sabbath observance long before Sinai codifies Sabbath law. The implication is sharp and unmistakable. True worship doesn't begin when humans invent it. It begins when humans align with heaven's clock. Then the king of Sodom offers Abraham payment wealth in exchange for risk. In Genesis, Abraham refuses with strong words. Jubilees deepens the refusal into principle. Abraham doesn't turn it down only because he's noble. He turns it down because he understands something most people don't. Accepting reward would tie him to human power, human obligation, human accounting. It would stitch his story into someone else's timeline. Abraham refuses because he is learning to live inside divine time, and to accept certain gifts is to accept certain chains. And as he continues on his way, the stars blaze overhead in patterns that, in Jubilee's imagination, speak back to him. Constellations don't merely decorate the night. They confirm the message the book keeps repeating. Nothing is drifting, nothing is chance. Everything is placed. Covenant, circumcision, and a geography already mapped. Jubilees turns the covenant scene into a moment of overwhelming precision. The voice tells Abraham to look upward and count the stars, and Abraham recognizes the familiar patterns he has studied since youth. Only now those patterns are reframed as the future of his bloodline, points of light linked to generations not yet born. And then Jubilees anchors the moment in time with a detail Genesis never supplies. It claims this covenant lands exactly 50 years, one complete Jubilee after Abraham's first break with idolatry. A perfect cycle, a completed span, heaven's calendar closing one chapter and opening another, right on schedule. Abraham falls into deep sleep, but Jubilees turns the sleep into ascent. His spirit is carried upward into vision, and there he witnesses the heavenly tablets, the luminous archive, where past and future lie already inscribed. And what he sees isn't only promise, it's map-making. The land is not described as a vague gift. It is presented like territory already measured, boundaries determined before creation, tribal allotments pre-drawn, geography treated as covenant structure rather than mere soil. The land isn't just where Abraham will live. It is where heaven intends to reorder the world. When Abraham wakes, the covenant becomes physical. Circumcision is commanded, and Jubilees frames it as more than a symbolic badge. It describes it like an alignment of the body with the pattern of heaven, a human life marked in flesh to match divine design, covenant made visible in the most intimate and irreversible way. Abraham obeys, even at 99, and the book layers the act with timing, performed at a specified hour, tied to the rhythm of sacred seasons, as though the sun itself is witnessing the cutting as a seal. And then Jubilees pulls the curtain back on something Genesis never narrates, a scene in heaven. Mastema, the accuser, the prosecuting force, steps forward before God's throne. Abraham is becoming too influential. Test him, press him, prove him. In Jubilees, Abraham's hardships are not random. They are structured contests, disputes in the invisible realm that play out through visible events. Human history becomes the stage where spiritual arguments are decided. So when three visitors arrive at Abraham's tent, Jubilees doesn't call them merely men. It identifies them plainly as angels, scheduled messengers, whose arrival is written into the record long before Abraham ever pitched a tent. Sarah laughs, and Jubilees treats even her laughter as part of the script recorded, echoed, and ultimately turned into the meaning of Isaac's name. By now, Abraham is not just a man receiving commands. Jubilees portrays him as a living instrument of sacred timing, like his very heartbeat is beginning to synchronize with heaven's rhythm. The binding of Isaac as a date in the future's shadow. Then comes the hardest story. Genesis tells it with frightening simplicity. A command, a journey, an altar, a knife raised, a voice that stops it. Jubilees keeps the same spine of the narrative, but thickens it with timing and foreshadowing until the event feels like a rehearsal for later history. The journey to Moriah, Jubilees claims, does not happen on a random day. It falls on a date that will later carry the weight of atonement, a day when future generations will also face the question of life, death, and divine mercy. The timing is intentional. The story is not only about faith, it is about alignment, a test placed on a specific day because the calendar itself is part of the meaning. For 3 days, Abraham and Isaac travel, and Jubilees turns the landscape into memory. Rivers are crossed with names that resemble Eden's waters. Hills appear shaped like places where angels gather. Everything feels like an echo of older sacred geography, as if the world is layered with holy landmarks, and Abraham is walking through a map only heaven can fully see. When Isaac asks the question, wood and fire are here, so where is the lamb? Abraham's answer becomes, in Jubilees, something more than reassurance. It becomes prophecy. The words are not a father's deflection. They are a statement grounded in a vision Abraham has already seen, a future he has already tasted through the heavenly tablets. God will provide. On the mountain, Abraham builds with precision. The stones aren't random. The arrangement follows patterns. He has been shown an altar shaped like a diagram of divine order. And Isaac is not depicted as an unaware child. Jubilees portrays him as a conscious participant, old enough and strong enough to resist, yet choosing submission. A willing offering, not a trapped victim. A human yes, placed inside a cosmic trial. When Abraham raises the knife, heaven intervenes with exactness. An angel calls out, stopping the act at the appointed moment. A ram appears, caught nearby, and Jubilees frames the substitution as more than convenient provision. It becomes a template, a rehearsal, an enacted pattern that will later repeat in other forms when other lives hang in balance on days marked long in advance. And when father and son descend the mountain, Jubilees seals the story with another calendrical echo. Their return aligns with a date that later generations will recognize as deliverance, a moment when death passes over those marked for covenant life. In Jubilees, that's the deeper claim behind every scene you've described. Abraham's life isn't simply narrated, it is scheduled. Melchizedek's bread and wine, the covenant vision, the circumcision, the angelic debates, the test on Moriah, each one becomes a gear in the same great mechanism. Time isn't a backdrop. Time is part of the revelation. And Abraham, the idol breaker who learned to read the sky, becomes the man through whom heaven tries to teach the earth how to count again. The timing wasn't accidental. Jubilees keeps insisting that these moments aren't merely meaningful. They are fulfillments of patterns laid down before the first human breath, when the heavenly tablets were first inscribed. In its world, the past doesn't just explain the present. The past schedules it. Rebekah, the twins, and inheritance read from heaven. When Abraham's servant approaches the well with his caravan, Jubilees frames the scene like a ritual already in motion. Abraham's command isn't treated as simple, tribal caution, don't marry Canaanites, but as cosmic necessity. Isaac's line must stay inside the portion God has kept, the thread reserved from Babel's division. Marriage isn't romance here, it's continuity of the timetable. So when Rebekah appears, Jubilees doesn't linger on a clever test with water the way Genesis does. It says the servant recognizes her immediately because angels had already described her to Abraham years earlier. Her features, her manner, even the sound of her voice match what heaven had revealed. The meeting becomes less a search and more a retrieval, like the right person has been placed in the right hour, and the servant has arrived to collect what was already appointed. Her journey to Isaac is tied to sacred dates as well. Jubilees claims she reaches Isaac's tent on the anniversary of Sarah's death, a day already marked in the heavenly record. Their meeting is framed as orchestration, not coincidence, one life arriving as another's legacy is sealed, the timeline closing one loop and opening the next. Then comes the long wait, 20 years of barrenness. Genesis mentions it. Jubilees explains it. The delay isn't merely biological struggle, it's timing. The twins must be born in a year, aligned with the celestial cycles. Even fertility, even the opening of the womb, follows heaven's schedule. And once Rebecca conceives, the conflict in her body becomes more than discomfort. Jubilees portrays it as a collision of destinies, two futures wrestling inside one mother, two possible trajectories for the covenant line. When she asks why it's happening, Jubilees fills the blank. Genesis leaves. She doesn't simply pray into the air. She goes to seek an answer from a living authority in sacred order, Melchizedek, still serving, still connected to the record. He tells her what she needs to hear. Two nations are within her, and the older will serve the younger. But in Jubilees, that prophecy isn't intuition or poetic blessing. It is presented as read directly from the heavenly tablets, unchanged since before creation. The future isn't being guessed. It's being disclosed. The births then become symbolic. Esau bursts out first, red, hairy, grasping life with urgency. Jacob follows, gripping the heel, as if even his first motion is about timing, holding back the one who runs ahead. Jubilees turns the contrast into theology. One child moving by impulse, the other learning rhythm. Esau becomes the hunter, driven outward, appetite-led. Jacob stays among tents, learning the stories, learning the calendar, learning how to live in measured time. So when the stew is simmering and Esau staggers in starving, Jubilees refuses to treat it as random circumstance. It ties the day to memory, an anniversary linked to Abraham's covenant experience, and frames the exchange as a collision between hunger and destiny. Esau wants immediate relief. Jacob wants alignment. In Genesis, it can look like opportunism. In Jubilees, it becomes reclaiming. Jacob isn't stealing a birthright. He's securing what heaven already assigned. Even the blessing scene is reframed. Jubilees claims Rebecca isn't improvising deception. She's following angelic instruction, shown to her in dreams, the method for bringing the right son into the right place at the right time. When Jacob receives Isaac's blessing, Jubilees imagines angels watching with approval, as if the scene isn't trickery but correction, human behavior being used, even through morally tangled means, to restore the schedule written above. And Esau's fury, in Jubilees, isn't merely family drama. It becomes the lever that moves the plot forward. His anger forces Jacob to flee, and the flight becomes the next necessary turn in the timetable. Jacob's ladder, as proof that management never stops. Night falls. Jacob sleeps with a stone under his head, stranded between identities no longer safe at home, not yet established elsewhere. And in that in-between place, Jubilees turns the ladder vision into a revelation of how the universe actually runs. The ladder isn't just an image of hope, it's infrastructure. Angels move up and down in ordered ranks, not wandering spirits, but agents crossing a boundary humans rarely see. They carry reports, they enforce judgments. They maintain the separation of realms that creation established. Jubilees treats Jacob's dream as a border crossing, Jacob accidentally sleeping in a thin place where heaven touches earth, where the veil is close enough to lift. God renews the promise given to Abraham. But Jubilees adds what it always adds, timing. This isn't a vague someday, it's a scheduled future. And when Jacob wakes, Jubilees expands the response into a formal act, oil poured, vows spoken, the date marked like Jacob is stamping a moment into the record. He commits a tenth, instituting a tithe the way Abraham did, and in Jubilees that makes him a timekeeper too, a man who understands that worship is not just feeling, but alignment. And while Jacob builds meaning on earth, Jubilees insists there is resistance in the unseen realm. Mastema watches. He has influence over the nations after Babel. The covenant line threatens his claim. So the book hints at shadow pressure, attempts to derail, tempt, distort. Yet angels guard Jacob's road to Laban, keeping him on schedule, not allowing the plot to be broken by accident or ambush. Bethel becomes more than a place name. It becomes a timestamp, a pinned coordinate in the Great Chronicle, proof that the ladder is real and the management never stops. Dinah, Shechem, and Jubilees' harsh obsession with boundaries. Then Jubilees moves into one of its most severe reinterpretations, Dinah's story, where Genesis reads like a tragic spiral of violation, negotiation, and violent revenge. Jubilees recasts the entire event as a lesson in boundary enforcement. Dinah visits the women of Shechem. The prince desires her and takes her. In Genesis, the son's response, circumcision, deception followed by slaughter, feels morally disturbing. Jubilees does something startling. It praises them. It says their deed is written for blessing in the heavenly tablets. Why? Because for Jubilees, intermarriage and mixing lines aren't social issues. They're cosmic threats. The world was divided among Noah's sons. Borders were set. Seed lines were assigned. And Canaan, already cursed and already portrayed as a trespasser, is treated as an unlawful presence in lands that matter to Shem's inheritance. In that framework, Dinah's violation isn't only personal tragedy, it becomes the symbol of a boundary crossed that must be repaired. So Simeon and Levi become, in Jubilee's telling, not merely hot-blooded brothers, but agents of divine justice, restoring the separation that should never have been breached. Jacob's fear of retaliation is reframed as unnecessary, because heaven itself shields them afterward, angels preventing revenge and preserving the covenant family's movement along the timeline. It's a hard reading, almost chilling in its simplicity. Genesis leaves room for moral complexity. Jubilees tightens the story into a single point. Boundaries are sacred, and heaven enforces them. Joseph sold, and the timetable holding steady. And then Jubilees turns to Joseph, the beloved story of betrayal and ascent. But again, it refuses to let events float. It attaches Joseph's tragedy to dates, anniversaries, and emotional pressure points that Genesis doesn't emphasize. Joseph's brothers plot against him on a day already heavy in their father Jacob's memory, an anniversary of grief, so that personal sorrow and family violence collapse onto the same point in time. Because that's what Jubilees wants you to feel. Even cruelty cannot throw history off its track. Humans act with jealousy, fear, hunger, lust, rage. But the timetable keeps absorbing every action, recording every choice, and carrying the story forward toward its appointed end. It isn't random coincidence in Jubilees, it's symmetry with intent. One grief answers another across generations, as though sorrow itself carries an echo that heaven can hear. The anniversary that weighs on Jacob becomes the day his sons commit the act that will fracture him, and Jubilees treats that overlap as proof of design. History rhymes because the tablets remember. The brothers strip Joseph of his coat and throw him into the pit. In Genesis, it feels like raw human emotion, jealousy, rivalry, the slow burn of resentment finally erupting. Jubilees doesn't deny that. It intensifies it. It says the hatred is not merely human heat, but fuel poured by an unseen hand. Mastema, the accuser, the adversarial force, seizes the moment as a chance to strike Jacob's faith. He whispers into the brother's anger, thickening it, pushing it past what nature alone would produce. The pit becomes more than a hole in the ground. It becomes a spiritual trapdoor, a place where a family's fracture can be turned into an accusation against God's promises. And yet Jubilees twists the knife in a way that feels almost paradoxical. What looks like dark victory is actually a step forward in heaven's plan. Joseph must go to Egypt. He must suffer. He must rise. He must become the storekeeper of life when famine arrives. The brothers think they're rewriting the future, but Jubilees says they are acting inside a story already scheduled. Their choice is real, and so is their guilt, but the timetable absorbs even their betrayal and carries it toward the destination. written long before Joseph's first breath. So when Midianite traders pull Joseph from the pit, Jubilees describes the road to Egypt like a pre-marked line on a map. The caravan moves as if guided by invisible coordinates. Even foreign dust becomes part of sacred geography. Joseph's descent into slavery, his false imprisonment, his sudden elevation through dreams, these aren't lucky breaks in this book. They are appointments. They land at the correct hour, because heaven's clock keeps ticking, even when covenant people are far from covenant land. Jacob's grief becomes its own kind of entry in the record. He puts on sackcloth, he weeps, he refuses comfort. Genesis shows the pain, Jubilees adds witnesses. Angels observe and write, not because God needs information, but because in this worldview nothing suffered by the righteous is meaningless. Every tear is counted. Every night of mourning becomes part of the ledger that proves the world is being watched, measured, and judged. The brothers' deception, goat's blood on the coat, becomes, in Jubilees, more than a lie told to a father. It becomes a moment Mastema delights in, falsehood triumphing over truth, appearance crushing reality. But once again, even the lie serves the design. It drives Jacob toward the future that will eventually carry him into Egypt, where the next phase of the timetable waits. Jubilees even ties Joseph's relocation to the ancient division of lands after Noah. Egypt belongs to Ham's allotment. Joseph's presence there is a boundary crossing. But it is a purposeful crossing, a seed planted in foreign soil, so that an even greater movement can occur later, the Exodus. Joseph's suffering becomes testimony. His endurance becomes preparation. And the heavenly scribes record everything, no moment wasted, no pain unregistered, no righteousness unseen. Then the pattern of sevens rises again. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Jubilees treats this not as meteorology, but as measured providence, abundance and scarcity, delivered like timed phases of a plan. Joseph fills storehouses when the sun shines. He distributes grain when hunger spreads. And when his brothers arrive seeking bread, the reunion unfolds as Genesis tells it: recognition, concealment, testing, revelation, tears. But Jubilees, faithful to its obsession, adds what it always adds: the dates. The moment Jacob hears Joseph is alive, the day he begins moving toward Egypt, the boundaries he crosses on the way. The whole journey becomes synchronized with promises spoken long ago to Abraham, as if the covenant is pulling the family like gravity. Pharaoh welcomes Jacob, and Jubilees treats the welcome like the opening of a test. Egypt is shelter, not home; provision, not inheritance. A place allowed for a season because heaven has already recorded the length of the stay, the suffering it will include, and the deliverance that will end it. Joseph settles the family in Goshen. They multiply, they prosper, and Jubilees warns that prosperity itself is dangerous. Comfort can dissolve identity. Egyptian gods can become familiar. Egyptian rhythms can replace sacred time. And Joseph, aging, feels the threat. So he gathers his brothers and demands an oath. They must not forget their homeland. They must carry his bones back when the return finally comes. In Jubilees, this isn't sentiment, it's alignment. Joseph belongs to the promised soil, not foreign ground. After Joseph's death, the temperature changes. A new pharaoh rises who did not know Joseph, and Jubilees expands that line into a spiritual shift. Different gods, different rhythms, different loyalties. The careful balance collapses. Suspicion becomes policy, policy becomes cruelty, and slavery, in Jubilees, isn't an overnight fall, it's a measured descent across counted years, recorded like everything else. When the decree comes, Hebrew boys thrown into the Nile, Jubilees sees a familiar shadow behind the throne, Mastema again. The same adversary who inflamed brothers now inflames an empire. Each drowned child becomes an assault on the covenant line, an attempt to strangle Abraham's promise in its cradle. But Jubilees insists the darkness has limits. Suffering is permitted only inside boundaries. The bondage has an end date already written. So Moses is born not by chance, not as a lucky interruption, but on schedule. The deliverer arrives when heaven ordains, neither early nor late. And even in misery, Jubilees imagines angels watching, counting lashes, recording tears, measuring the rising cry of a people that will soon reach the throne and trigger liberation. Moses versus Mastema, Exodus as a two-realm war. When Jubilees turns to Exodus, it doesn't merely retell plagues. It reframes the entire confrontation as a war with two fronts. Pharaoh is stubborn, yes, but Jubilees says the stubbornness is reinforced. Mastema stands behind it, strengthening resistance beyond human pride. This isn't just politics. It's spiritual conflict expressed through politics. Moses returns carrying heaven's authority, and the plagues become more than disasters. Jubilees treats them like angelic strikes, targeted blows against Egypt's gods and the powers operating behind those gods. The Nile turned to blood is not only a warning, it is an assault on river deities and the spiritual economy Egypt trusts. Frogs, flies, disease, boils each plague, strips away the illusion that Egypt's divine order can protect it. When Moses' staff becomes a serpent and devours the magician's serpents, Jubilees reads the moment as direct confrontation, heaven swallowing counterfeit power. The Egyptian sorcerers can imitate some signs, and Jubilees attributes even that to Mastema's desperation, using mimicry to persuade Pharaoh that Moses has no special authority. For a moment, it works. Pharaoh stiffens. But the book draws a boundary Mastema cannot cross. His power can distort, it cannot create. He can counterfeit at scale, but not at the level of true creation. When the magicians fail and admit, this is the finger of God, Jubilees treats it like a verdict in the invisible realm. The accuser has reached his limit. Darkness falls over Egypt, and, in Jubilees, it symbolizes more than the absence of light. It is the fading of illegitimate spiritual authority. Egypt's gods are being unmasked, one layer at a time, while the calendar of judgment moves forward toward its final mark. Then comes the most unsettling turn, the final plague. In Jubilees' telling, Mastema becomes the destroyer, but only under strict divine control. The adversary who tried to destroy Israel is forced into a role that serves heaven's purpose. He is permitted to act, but only within boundaries, only where judgment has been authorized. The one who accuses becomes, unwillingly, an instrument of the verdict. It's a chilling idea, and it fits Jubilees' worldview perfectly. Even the powers of darkness do not operate freely. They operate on a leash. They can tempt, accuse, inflame, but they cannot break the timetable written on the heavenly tablets. In the end, even their hostility becomes another gear in the mechanism they hate, pushing history forward toward the appointed liberation. In Jubilees, Passover isn't treated as a single dramatic night in Egypt that Israel remembers later. It's treated as a fixed point in the architecture of time, a date that exists with weight in heaven, a moment that doesn't merely happen but is kept. Like an appointment, the universe itself must honor. And the blood on the doorposts? Jubilees doesn't present it as a simple sign for a passing messenger who needs directions. It presents it as a binding restraint on Mastema. The mark isn't just information, it's a barrier. Where the blood is properly placed, the accuser cannot enter. His reach collapses against that boundary, and his power, so loud in courts and councils, breaks against something almost offensively simple: obedience performed at the appointed time. That is why Jubilees lingers on the first Passover with such intensity. It is the moment Israel learns what heaven already knows. Timing is protection. Correct time, correct ritual, correct alignment. These don't merely commemorate salvation. They participate in it. So as Israel prepares to leave Egypt, Jubilees imagines Mastema making a final desperate move. Pharaoh has agreed, the doors are opening, the people are walking out, but the accuser cannot tolerate a clean escape, so he presses Pharaoh to pursue. Not because Pharaoh suddenly thinks rationally again, but because the adversary is still trying to convert liberation into disaster, trying to drown the promise at the last possible second. When the sea splits, Jubilees reads the event as more than spectacle. It becomes a battlefield between realms. Angels drive the waters back into a corridor, holding creation's boundaries steady long enough for the covenant people to pass. And behind the Egyptian charge, Jubilees imagines Mastema urging the troops forward, forcing the empire to crash into a trap it cannot see. Then heaven wins decisively. The waters return, chariots vanish, the pursuit ends. But Jubilees goes one step further. The drowning doesn't only end a military threat. It shatters Mastema's authority over Israel for a season. He retreats wounded, humiliated, not destroyed but diminished. He will return in the wilderness because Jubilees never allows evil to disappear completely. Yet his defeat at the sea becomes a spiritual milestone, an echo that will carry forward into future generations, the way flood anniversaries and covenant dates carry forward, a date stamped into the record. And this is the steady heartbeat underneath Jubilees' entire Exodus vision. None of it is improvisation. Not the plagues, not the negotiations, not the sea, not the singing on the shore. It all happens exactly when the heavenly tablets say it must happen. The accuser can resist, counterfeit, inflame, and accuse, but he cannot derail the schedule. The Exodus as a calendar event, not just a rescue. Jubilees insists the Exodus begins on a day heaven has been holding open since creation. The 14th day of the first month isn't simply chosen because it worked out. It is presented as pre-marked, written into the divine calendar as the date freedom would erupt like spring sunlight breaking through winter cloud. That's why the book describes Israel's posture that night with almost ritual urgency. Lambs slaughtered at twilight, meals eaten in haste, sandals on, staffs in hand. But the detail Jubilees loves most is what it imagines above and around those homes, angels standing watch. Not merely hovering passively, but actively guarding, enforcing the boundary that the blood creates. The destroyer is not treated as a vague force. It is treated as a hostile agent searching for vulnerability, restrained by a sign that is also a seal. And the precision matters because Jubilees ties the date to promise. Freedom arrives to the day, in fulfillment of what was spoken to Abraham generations earlier. In Jubilees' imagination, covenant promise is not only moral, it's chronological. Heaven doesn't only promise what it will do. Heaven sets when it will do it. At the sea, Jubilees shifts the tone again. The waters part, not as a random supernatural trick, but as a return to creation's original boundaries, as if the sea remembers the lines God drew on day 2 and temporarily steps back into obedience. Pharaoh's army drowns because it's not merely chasing people, it's chasing against the divine timeline. The sea closing becomes, symbolically, time itself crushing those who tried to oppose its flow. Israel sings on the shore, but Jubilees adds another layer. Angels join the song. Human voices and heavenly voices blending, freedom resonating across realms. Passover becomes not only something Israel remembers, it becomes something heaven keeps, an eternal reality echoed each time the feast is observed correctly. Then comes the wilderness, and Jubilees keeps doing what it always does. It turns wandering into schedule. Camps, water stops, tests, none of it happens whenever. The manna doesn't fall randomly. It arrives when heavenly storehouses open at their designated times. Even hunger and provision are timed. And as Sinai approaches, Jubilees makes a provocative claim about what Moses is truly being given. Not just laws, but a clock, a covenant calendar, a way to align Earth's rhythm with heaven's rhythm. Sinai, the revelation of time itself. The mountain shakes, smoke rises, lightning carves the air, Moses climbs. But Jubilees says Sinai's purpose goes beyond commandments carved in stone. Moses receives the secret history of time, revealed by the angel of the presence, one of heaven's highest ministers, who claims he will show Moses everything from the beginning of creation. Forward. And at the center of that revelation sits the 364-day calendar, perfect weeks, stable seasons, dates that always land where they should. No drift, no correction, no human patchwork. In Jubilees, that mathematical elegance is theology. Because if the calendar is divisible by 7, then Sabbath can remain fixed. Festivals can remain anchored. Worship can remain synchronized. Moses is shown the heavenly tablets, not only commandments, but the script of history. Feast days aren't invented later, they're established before humanity. The celestial bodies are placed not merely to illuminate, but to serve as clock hands, sun, moon, and stars moving on paths that declare sacred timing. And Jubilees draws a straight line across generations. Adam knew these rhythms. Enoch recorded them. Noah preserved them through floodwaters. But humans keep drifting away. They chase moon cycles that wander. They add days where none should be added. They celebrate at the wrong times, and creation itself is portrayed as groaning under misalignment. In this worldview, sin isn't only moral failure, it's temporal rebellion. Breaking commands is serious, but breaking timing is catastrophic, because timing is part of creation's structure. To work on the Sabbath isn't merely overworking, it's tearing at the seam between worlds. To keep a feast on the wrong day isn't just a scheduling mistake, it's worship offered out of phase with heaven. That is why Jubilees cherishes law, not because it loves restriction, but because it sees law as the user manual for reality. Commandments become windows, not walls openings, through which divine order shines into human life. Sabbath isn't a day off. It's a day when humans can taste, briefly, the harmony angels inhabit continually. Food laws aren't framed as diet trends. They're presented as boundaries that protect spiritual integrity. Sexual regulations aren't merely private ethics. They're portrayed as safeguards for creation's fabric, because violations are imagined to rip holes where corruption can spread. And underneath all of it runs the book's stubborn, unyielding message. Israel is chosen not only to believe the right things, but to keep time. To be the people whose worship stays in rhythm, whose feasts and fasts function like tuning forks, drawing earth back toward the pitch of heaven. Jubilees ends up making a claim that can sound extreme, but it's consistent with its entire universe. The covenant isn't only a set of rules, it's a way of living inside time correctly. To keep the calendar is to keep the covenant. To keep Passover properly is to touch a freedom that, in Jubilee's mind, exists eternally in heaven. To forget the appointed times is to drift not only culturally, but cosmically out of harmony with how the world was built. When Israel keeps these commands in Jubilees, they aren't merely behaving well, they are participating in repair, a kind of cosmic restoration that reaches beyond personal morality. Obedience becomes alignment, alignment becomes healing. The law, in this worldview, is less a fence built to restrict life, and more a tuning system meant to bring a dissonant world back into pitch. That's why even the strangest regulations suddenly make a different kind of sense. Consider the command to cover nakedness while relieving oneself. Modern readers often hear only modesty. Jubilees hears something deeper, boundary maintenance. The human body, in its most vulnerable functions, stands at the edge between clean and unclean, holy and common. The law insists those edges remain guarded not because the body is shameful, but because holiness is fragile when boundaries collapse. Jubilees even mirrors heaven in this. Angels, it suggests, shield themselves in the most sacred spaces, not out of embarrassment, but out of reverence for the separation between realms. Humans imitate that pattern on Earth. In other words, what looks like an odd campsite rule becomes a miniature ritual of cosmic order, a small act that echoes a larger architecture. And for the writer of Jubilees, the law's beauty isn't only in what it commands, but in when it commands it. Every rule has an appointed moment. Circumcision on the 8th day. Offerings at precise points in the agricultural cycle. Festivals synchronized to the sun's movement through the year. These aren't details the author sprinkles in for realism. They are doorways, moments when human action can line up with something eternal. That's also why Jubilees is so uncompromising compared to many other Jewish writings of its time. Here, the law is not flexible. It's not a framework waiting to be interpreted. It's presented as fixed as creation itself. The angel tells Moses, these commands existed before humanity and will outlast humanity. They're not cultural artifacts. They're constants like gravity, like seasons, like the rhythm of the week. So the book's obsession with exactness becomes clearer. The wrong day matters, the wrong ritual matters, the wrong boundary matters. Because in Jubilees, Error isn't merely mistake, it's misalignment, and misalignment is disruption. Sin doesn't only harm neighbors, it tears at the seam between earth and heaven, disturbing the harmony creation was built to sustain. Moses then comes to understand the law not as a test designed to trip humans, but as an invitation into belonging. To live by heaven's rhythm is to step, even if briefly, into the way angels experience time, not as a straight line rushing toward decay, but as a patterned movement, a cycle with meaning, a dance that repeats without drifting. And this is Jubilee's most audacious promise. The law makes humans more than mortal in how they live. If their actions fall into rhythm with heaven, those actions begin to resonate beyond death. The smallest choice becomes an echo in the unseen realm. Ordinary life turns into a kind of liturgy. The commandments read like burdens, only if you assume time is empty. If time is sacred structure, then the commandments become love letters from heaven, instructions for how to live inside days while still touching eternity. Feast days, when timing becomes a bridge. The sun drops, stars appear. A new month begins, but which month, and by what calendar? To most people, that sounds like housekeeping. In Jubilees, it's everything. The angel tells Moses that feast days aren't just celebrations. They are thin places in time, moments when the distance between realms narrows. Keep them at the right time, and a door opens. Keep them late or early, and the door still opens, but no one is standing there. The opportunity passes unused, not because God is petty, but because the universe, in Jubilee's imagination, runs on appointed moments. Passover begins the sacred year, and Jubilees doesn't treat it as remembrance, only it treats it as a channel. On the 14th day of the first month, at the precise time, Israel doesn't just retell freedom, they participate in it. Liberation becomes something that can be re-entered, like a current that flows strongest at its appointed hour. That is why the book insists on the 364-day solar year. The angel warns that a lunar system drifts, sliding festivals through seasons until the holy days no longer land where heaven intended them. Jubilees treats that drift as disaster, not a clerical error, but a spiritual fracture. The warning is severe because the stakes are severe. Celebrating at the wrong time turns what should be holy into something hollow, a feast day that becomes, in the book's words, effectively profaned by misplacement. And blood, in this system, becomes central not because heaven hungers for violence, but because blood represents life itself. Offered correctly, at the correct time, blood becomes a conduit. Life given back to the giver in an act of alignment. That's why the Passover blood matters so much. The angel describes it not as decoration but as an actual barrier against destruction, a boundary marker that hostile forces cannot cross. The Day of Atonement receives the same treatment. It isn't simply about personal forgiveness, it's about cosmic cleansing. On that day, heaven's courts are described as unusually accessible. Prayers rise more directly. Mercy moves more freely. But Jubilees insist that if you place the day wrong, the gates are closed, not because God refuses to listen, but because the appointment has been missed. Tabernacles isn't merely a historical reenactment either. It becomes participatory. Temporary shelters are a way of briefly living closer to the early world, when the boundary between heaven and earth was thinner, newer, less hardened by centuries of rebellion. First fruits, Pentecost, new moon observances, each creates its own bridge, its own opening, its own precise alignment. And then Jubilees delivers its warning about accumulation. 10 days of drift per year doesn't sound catastrophic until you multiply it. Seasons shift under your feet, feasts slide out of place. The calendar becomes unreliable. The world stops matching the sky. Heaven keeps opening doors on schedule, but the people arrive late, again and again, until they forget the doors exist at all. That's why Jubilees treats calendar disputes as spiritual warfare. Confusion about times and seasons isn't neutral. It becomes a battlefield. The forces opposing divine order, led by Mastema, don't always tempt through obvious sins. They tempt through misalignment. They push humans to keep the wrong time until worship still looks like worship, but it no longer lines up with heaven's rhythm. And in Jubilee's logic, That means people can unknowingly serve the very principle of confusion they think they are resisting. So faithfulness becomes not only what you do, but when you do it. Blood and timing and covenant weave together into a single fabric. These are not holidays. They are holy days, moments when eternity touches time, when human celebration harmonizes with angelic worship, when creation briefly re-enters alignment with its maker. The feasts become medicine for a broken world. Realignment through precision, restoration through rhythm. Mastema's final tricks. And while Moses receives this flawless calendar on the mountain, Jubilees insists the darkness below does not sit quietly. The angel tells him Mastema has not been idle. He is watching. He is adjusting his strategies. If he cannot break Israel through brute force, he will attempt something subtler, to fracture their relationship with time itself, nudging them toward the wrong days, the wrong rhythms, the wrong seasons, until covenant obedience becomes a scattered song, no longer sung in heaven's key. As divine order is being revealed on the mountain, Jubilees says disorder is being engineered below. That contrast is one of the book's most distinctive moves. Revelation above, sabotage below, two realms moving at once, both focused on the same target. And in Jubilees, the target isn't only Israel's behavior, it's Israel's timing. This is where Jubilees offers its most unusual vision of spiritual warfare. Mastema isn't presented as God's equal opposite, and he isn't quite the full-blown Satan of later imagination. He reads more like a prosecuting attorney who has forgotten the purpose of the courtroom. He was meant to test, to sift, to expose what's real, yet he's grown addicted to conviction. He doesn't just want humans to be examined, he wants them to fail. The angel tells Moses that Mastema approaches the throne with accusations against Israel, pointing out how quickly they drift, how easily they complain, how rapidly they lose patience. They aren't worthy of your law. But Jubilees makes clear that this is only the surface strategy. The deeper strategy is subtler and more dangerous. Disconnect the people from the calendar, confuse the times and seasons, blur the lines between appointed moments. If the covenant is a rhythm, Mastema's goal is to knock it out of beat. So when the people grow restless at the base of the mountain, Jubilees doesn't portray their impatience as simple weakness. It frames it as temporal collapse. Moses has been gone too long. The promise feels delayed. The moment feels mistimed. And in that confusion, Mastema finds his opening. He whispers that the waiting has exceeded what was reasonable. He turns delay into distrust. He turns uncertainty about time into rebellion against God. In that light, the golden calf becomes more than idolatry. It becomes an attempt to seize control of sacred schedule, to manufacture religion on demand, to create a worship event without heaven's appointment. It is a human calendar asserting itself against a divine one. The angel explains this as Mastema's specialty, not only pushing people toward the wrong acts, but toward the wrong acts at the wrong time. And Jubilees claims this has been Mastema's pattern across history. He doesn't always appear in obvious temptations. He appears at thresholds, transitions, boundary moments, turning points when the divine clock is striking a meaningful hour. Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac is one of Jubilees' clearest examples. The test, it says, didn't originate as God's curiosity. It was provoked. Mastema challenged God. He loves his son. Demand the boy, and he will refuse. The trial becomes a courtroom contest, suggested by the accuser, designed to produce failure, yet ultimately exposing Abraham's alignment instead. Jubilees treats the drama on Moriah as spiritual litigation, an accusation answered by obedience. Jacob's crises are pulled into the same frame. The wrestling at daybreak becomes more than a mysterious nighttime struggle. Jubilees casts it as interference, one of Mastema's agents trying to block Jacob from crossing into the promised land at the appointed time. The fight isn't only physical, it's a delay tactic. Keep him from entering on schedule, break the timing, and the story fractures. Even the Egyptian magicians are reinterpreted through this lens. Their mimicry isn't portrayed as neutral skill, but as borrowed, limited access to Mastema's power. Jubilees draws a hard boundary. He can imitate, distort, counterfeit, but he cannot create. He can twist what God has made, but he cannot bring something new into being. That's why the resistance collapses as the plagues intensify. The accuser's reach hits a ceiling. Divine power continues without needing to negotiate with the counterfeit. And Jubilees adds an extra layer that makes the Exodus feel like a strategic operation. It suggests that after the early confrontations, Mastema is restrained for a time bound, limited so he cannot interfere openly, as Israel's liberation accelerates. That restraint explains why later plagues face no magical counterplay. The courtroom prosecutor is temporarily removed from the room, but now, at Sinai, as covenant life is about to be installed, Mastema returns to what Jubilees considers his most effective method. He doesn't attack God directly, he attacks alignment. He pushes imprecision. He cedes almost right observance. He encourages drift, wrong calendars, sliding feast days, forgotten Sabbaths, blurred boundaries, because in Jubilees those aren't minor errors, they are openings. The angel explains the punishment in a way that makes it feel less like arbitrary penalty and more like consequence. When people step out of heaven's timing, they step out from under certain protections. Disorder flows into the gaps. Confusion breeds confusion. Disease, conflict, fragmentation, these are described as what naturally rushes into spaces where sacred rhythm has been abandoned. Mastema doesn't even need to destroy people outright. He only needs to get them operating on the wrong timetable. And then Jubilees delivers its most chilling implication. This kind of distortion can take generations to undo, not because God is holding a grudge, but because misalignment compounds. Children inherit more than family traits. They inherit positioning habits, rhythms, calendars, festivals, misplaced for decades until the entire sense of sacred time becomes unrecognizable. Realignment isn't a quick fix, it's a slow return. It can take generations for the rhythm to be recovered. Yet the angel offers hope in the way Jubilees always offers it, through the idea of a remnant. Even in widespread confusion, some will keep the authentic count, some will celebrate at the correct moments, some will maintain the fixed rhythm, and through that small thread, the path back remains open, narrow, difficult, but never fully closed. The hidden war, calendars as battleground. Nothing ignites Jubilees' anger more than the clash of calendars, because to this author, calendars aren't administrative tools. They are spiritual allegiance made visible. Jubilees stakes everything on one claim. God created a flawless 364-day solar year, and that year isn't merely a way to count. It is the heartbeat of creation. The sun's path marks holy time, steady, dependable, unchanging. In contrast, the moon is portrayed as fickle, a wandering marker that causes drift and disorder. The math becomes theology. A 364-day year divides perfectly into weeks, 52 complete cycles. Each season becomes exactly 13 weeks, 4 quarters of 91 days, no leftover fractions, no sliding holidays, no human corrections needed. In that structure, Sabbaths remain fixed. Festivals anchor to their appointed dates and never wander through the year. And Jubilees doesn't just claim Israel should keep that rhythm. It claims heaven itself keeps it. Angels observe the same feasts on the same days, year after unchanging year. So when humans adopt lunar reckoning, the author treats it as more than cultural variation. It becomes rebellion worship, slipping out of phase with heaven. Holy days fall on the wrong dates, alignment shatters. The gates open, but the people aren't there. That's why, in Jubilees, the calendar dispute isn't academic. It's warfare. The wrong calendar doesn't merely misplace a feast, it misplaces a people. It trains them to live out of sync until they forget what synchronization even felt like. And from that point on, Mastema barely has to push. Confusion becomes self-sustaining. The community at Qumran held on to this idea the way someone clings to a rope in a flood. Their writings breathe urgency, an intensity that goes far beyond ordinary devotion. They weren't simply interested in a solar calendar. They treated it like the difference between standing inside God's order and drifting outside of it. From their perspective, Jerusalem's priesthood had done something catastrophic. The official temple system, by using a lunar schedule, had, so they believed, thrown worship out of phase with heaven. And once worship slid off the appointed days, everything else followed. Covenant life became mistimed, sacrifice became mistimed, festivals became mistimed. In their eyes, Israel wasn't merely making minor adjustments. Israel was breaking alignment at the deepest level. That's why these calendar fights never felt like abstract debates to them. They felt like warfare over access, over whether the gates between realms were opening and whether anyone was standing at the threshold when they did. In this worldview, disaster doesn't fall at random. Catastrophe is not bad luck. Catastrophe is what happens when a people move against the grain of sacred time. Follow false time, they thought, and you inevitably harvest judgment. They read national suffering as a symptom of calendrical betrayal. A nation living on the wrong schedule can't remain protected in the way it was meant to be protected. Jubilees feeds that conviction with its own cosmic imagery. It describes the lights of heaven not as ornaments but as instruments set in motion, as if God built a clock into the sky. The sun is not merely brighter than the moon. It is portrayed as the primary ruler of sacred measurement, the stable marker that keeps days and seasons from drifting. The moon, by contrast, becomes a lesser lamp useful for night, but unfit as the backbone of holy timing. The point isn't astronomy. The point is authority, which light governs the calendar, governs the covenant rhythm. For modern ears, that obsession can sound extreme, even strange. But in ancient religious imagination, timing wasn't administrative. Timing was spiritual physics. A prayer offered when heaven's doors were not open was wasted breath. A feast celebrated on the wrong day was a celebration with no resonance noise that didn't match the song heaven was singing. So the Essene-like community that treasured texts such as Jubilees shaped their entire life around the solar count. Dawn prayers were synchronized to the sun's progress. Holy days were observed according to their own calculations, not Jerusalem's official announcements. They lived like people waiting for correction, waiting for the day heaven would restore proper time publicly, when stars and feasts and angels would move in flawless agreement again. And that impulse never truly disappeared from religious history. It shows up whenever a group becomes convinced that official sacred rhythm has been corrupted and that the faithful must recover the original schedule. Calendars become power symbols. Who gets to define the holy day? Priests, prophets, elders, tradition, revelation. Time becomes a battleground because time, in this kind of worldview, decides who is actually aligned with God. Land, law, and time as one covenant cord. In Jubilees, 3 strands are braided so tightly they can't be separated without snapping the whole structure. Land, law, and time. The land is not merely territory, it is sacred space, a zone where heaven's order is meant to be practiced on earth. The law is not merely a set of rules, it is the operating pattern of reality. And time is the binding thread that ties both together, turning obedience into rhythm, rhythm into harmony, harmony into protection. So when the angel speaks to Moses, the urgency isn't just moral, it's architectural. The land promised to Abraham's descendants is described as mapped with intention, borders drawn as if they reflect a heavenly pattern. Rivers, mountains, plains, and boundaries don't feel accidental, they feel appointed. And because the space is sacred, it carries conditions. The land holds the covenant people only as long as they live in covenant alignment. That is where Jubilees become startlingly physical. It treats disobedience not merely as legal guilt, but as pollution that the land itself reacts to. Break the Sabbaths, defile the appointed feasts, blur the boundaries God established. And the soil, metaphorically, almost as if the earth has a moral immune system, will reject what doesn't belong. Then Jubilees pushes even harder. The law did not begin with Moses. It presents Torah as eternal, inscribed before humanity, written on heavenly tablets by divine authority. Angels observe these same principles. Adam knew them. The patriarchs practiced them long before Sinai. Abraham isn't discovering morality, he's recovering it. The ancestors are not fumbling in the dark toward truth. They're portrayed as receiving instruction through angelic teaching and maintaining a full covenant pattern earlier than later tradition might assume. And this is where Jubilees quietly challenges the idea that law can evolve through human interpretation. In its vision, no court can adjust divine command. No emergency can suspend holy time. The commands are fixed like celestial reference points. Stars don't negotiate their orbits, and the law doesn't negotiate its demands. The stakes are not merely national success, either. Jubilees makes the covenant feel cosmic. Israel's obedience doesn't just affect Israel, it affects the harmony of realms. Keep sacred time and sacred boundaries, and order flows outward. Break them, and chaos threatens to spread, as if the whole creation is sensitive to whether the covenant line is functioning properly. That responsibility is framed as both burden and honor. Israel becomes the people entrusted with true timing. Their priests are imagined as serving alongside heavenly counterparts. Their festivals are portrayed as opening moments, gates, bridges, alignments where earth can resonate with heaven. Jubilees traces genealogies with obsessive care because bloodline, in this worldview, is also memory line. Knowledge of sacred time travels from father to son, like inheritance. Abraham blesses Jacob rather than Esau, because Jacob is pictured as the guardian of rhythm. Joseph resists Egypt not merely to preserve moral purity, but to preserve identity and timing in a land with different gods and different schedules. Everything keeps returning to the same claim. If you lose the calendar, you lose the covenant's heartbeat. The prophecy of drift. Then on the mountain, the angel's voice turns somber. Jubilees doesn't pretend Israel will hold the rhythm forever. It portrays the future with painful clarity, not as vague warning, but as foreknown drift. They will enter the land, they will flourish, and then, slowly, they will slide. Not usually through dramatic rebellion, but through small misalignments that compound over decades. First, the festivals shift a little. Then they're kept inconsistently. Then they're treated as tradition, rather than as portals of alignment. Eventually, the reason for the rhythm is forgotten. Jubilees frames apostasy like a boat losing its anchor. It doesn't flip instantly. It drifts. Foreign customs creep in. Sabbaths are treated casually. Boundaries blur food, marriage, worship, and the calendar becomes the first crack that widens into a break. Once time is wrong, everything else becomes easier to rationalize. The divine response, in this vision, arrives in measured steps. Warnings come first. Prophets speak. If the people ignore the warnings, pressure arrives through foreign powers. If pressure is ignored, collapse follows. The temple center of right timing, right sacrifice, right alignment falls. The land expels its people into exile, not as petty revenge, but as the inevitable consequence of living out of harmony with the space's sacred purpose. Yet Jubilees never lets despair have the final word. It always preserves a remnant, those who keep the rhythm when the majority forgets. In the darkest seasons, covenant memory survives in smaller circles, carried like ember through wind. And eventually, after punishment and purging, restoration comes. The people turn back, they rebuild, they recalibrate sacred time. They return to the calendar of their ancestors. The covenant rhythm is recovered. History, then, is not portrayed as straight-line progress. It's portrayed as spiral movement away from alignment and back toward it. The same choices return in new generations. Will they keep heaven's rhythm or substitute their own? For the people who likely first treasured this book, living under cultural pressure, threatened by assimilation, tempted to compromise this prophecy, would have felt like both warning and comfort. Your struggle isn't new, the book implies. You're inside a pattern, and your faithfulness, especially in something as practical as a calendar, is not outdated stubbornness. It's resistance against universal error, the last chapters of time. Then Jubilees lifts the veil even further, past cycles of disobedience and return, and offers a closing vision that feels almost like sunrise after a long night. The future becomes a recovery story. Not escape from creation, but healing of creation. Human lifespans, shortened after Eden, begin to lengthen again. Peace grows, disease retreats. The earth yields abundance with less struggle. Children are described as growing into deep wisdom, learning law, and returning to righteousness, as though covenant memory becomes natural again, instead of difficult. What's striking is how Jubilees imagines redemption working. It isn't always depicted as a sudden cosmic explosion. It feels gradual restoration unfolding across generations. Families teach forgotten wisdom. Communities rebuild old practices. The authentic calendar spreads again, bringing human life back into resonance with the celestial order. And alongside restoration comes separation. Those who cling to corruption and false timing find themselves outside the renewed harmony. The book describes a dividing line between those who preserved covenant rhythm and those who refused it, a moral and temporal distinction as much as a social one. Unlike some later apocalyptic visions, Jubilees doesn't always emphasize total destruction, followed by an entirely new world. Its hope is often more intimate and, in a way, more demanding. The same world is healed. The same sun and moon witness restoration. The same promised land receives the returned people. The same law guides the final generations. Paradise isn't replaced, it's recovered. And the angel speaks as if it's already written, because in Jubilees, it is. The end, like the beginning, lies on the tablets. Time doesn't wander. Time returns. History bends back toward first truths. The golden age isn't only behind humanity, it waits ahead, not as something alien, but as the restoration of what was lost when the rhythm broke. From the divine vantage point that Jubilees keeps returning to, the last generation isn't far away. It stands beside the first like two pages of the same book held open at once. Beginning and ending coexist in the same record. That's why the story closes without frantic forecasting or a checklist of future headlines. It closes with a calmer certainty. The pattern stitched into stars, seasons, and sacred cycles cannot collapse. What is written in heaven will eventually take shape on earth. Time isn't drifting. Time is carrying creation home. How a book that claimed to master time was almost erased by time. And then, almost unbelievably, the book vanishes. Not with a bonfire and a public decree, but with something quieter and far more common in history, a slow fade. Jubilees slips out of widespread Jewish life the way a familiar song disappears when no one teaches it to the next generation. Once treasured in certain circles as a companion voice beside Torah, it gradually becomes a marginal text, then a rumor, then a curiosity until, in most places, it isn't even that. The eclipse makes more sense when you picture the world that followed Jerusalem's destruction. With the temple gone, Jewish leaders faced an emergency that was spiritual, social, and practical all at once. How do you continue covenant life without an altar? How do you mark holy time without the machinery of priestly service? How does a scattered people remain one people? Rabbinic Judaism answered with an astonishing act of adaptation. Prayer and study rise to replace sacrifice. The home and the synagogue become portable sanctuaries. Tradition becomes something that can travel with a refugee's bundle, something that can survive in exile without stone walls or incense smoke. That shift demanded flexibility. It required a calendar that could function across distances and across changing conditions. It required interpretive space room for legal reasoning, debate, adjustment, and communal decision-making. In that new reality, Jubilees could feel less like an aid and more like a constraint. Its calendar wasn't simply strict. It was uncompromising in a way that didn't easily match the needs of dispersed communities. Its insistence on a fixed solar year and unchanging festival placements collided with the evolving calculations and practices that helped a scattered people stay coordinated. Just as importantly, Jubilees left very little room for what rabbinic tradition would hold as essential: the authority of ongoing interpretation and the legitimacy of a living oral tradition. Jubilees speaks as if the script is already written, already sealed, already beyond revision. It presents law and timing as cosmic constants, not communal responsibilities shaped through study. For a leadership trying to rebuild Jewish life after catastrophe, that posture could feel like a dead end, beautiful in theory, but brittle in practice. Meanwhile, the communities that loved Jubilees most passionately weren't in a position to defend it forever. The Dead Sea movement that treated the solar calendar as a boundary marker between true Israel and a corrupted establishment did not remain a stable public force. Their settlements disappeared, their world shattered. The very places where Jubilees had been clutched like a lifeline became ruins and silence. And when a community vanishes, its library often becomes an echo. Calendar wars also lose heat when the altar fire goes out. In a world without temple sacrifice, the argument over which day the priest should offer which offering doesn't carry the same social gravity. Time is still sacred, but the institutional center that made calendar disputes explosive is gone. The old urgency cools. The debates narrow. Texts that once mattered to a fierce minority slip to the edge. Christianity, taking shape in the same centuries, carried its own complicated relationship with Jewish law and sacred time. Some early followers were clearly aware of traditions that feel Jubilees adjacent, expanded angelic roles, intensified purity logic, stories that sound like they come from an older stream than the final biblical forms. But as the movement spread among non-Jews, a tight calendrical system could easily look like a barrier rather than a bridge. Many communities leaned toward a simpler proclamation rather than a complex timetable. Over time, texts that amplified strict law and fixed festival structures became less central outside of places where older traditions remained strong. So Jubilees recedes across much of the Jewish and Christian world, not necessarily because it was debunked, but because it represented a path that fewer communities chose to keep walking. Its vision offered certainty, but it offered it at a cost: minimal adaptability, minimal interpretive growth, and a relentless demand for precision that becomes difficult when your people are scattered across empires. For centuries, the book that claimed to reveal the secrets of time became, ironically, a victim of time sleeping in corners of the world most Western readers never thought to look. Ethiopia keeps the flame, but one region did keep looking without ever needing to rediscover anything. In Ethiopia, Jubilees doesn't reappear like a lost relic. It simply continues. While much of the world forgets this text exists, Ethiopian Christianity holds it close, preserving it as scripture across generations with the quiet confidence of a tradition that never stopped listening. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church stands nearly alone among Christian traditions in treating Jubilees as part of its canonical collection. In that setting, Jubilees isn't a strange fringe work. It's a familiar voice read, copied, remembered, and woven into the texture of religious life. That survival wasn't merely accidental isolation, though geography played a role. Ethiopia's Christian development followed its own course, often separated from the theological and institutional pressures that shaped canon debates elsewhere. But the deeper reason is resonance. Jubilees speaks a language that fits naturally with Ethiopian spiritual sensibilities: sacred time, angelic oversight, covenant continuity, purity boundaries, a world where heaven and earth remain in constant interaction. Even the names Ethiopia gives the text hint at how it was received, not as a rival story, but as a companion lens, a little Genesis, a book that divides and organizes time, a narrative that fills in what seems missing and emphasizes what feels central. Ethiopian tradition also preserved other works that share the same gravitational pull toward election, sacred objects, and continuity texts that celebrate the idea that divine purpose threads through history in tangible ways. In monasteries and churches by lakes, in highlands, carved into rock scribes copied manuscripts for centuries. Many of them were not thinking in terms of Western canon or academic debates. They were simply doing what their tradition required, keeping the words alive. So when modern scholars eventually encountered Jubilees again, the shock wasn't only that the text existed. The shock was that it had been alive all along, held in living communities, not just in museum fragments. Early modern translations came not from desert scraps, but from Ethiopian manuscripts maintained through devotion rather than excavation. Pages were worn smooth by use, not by time's decay, handled by readers who never assumed the book was questionable or peripheral. Ethiopia's preservation of Jubilees reveals something that canon histories sometimes hide. Religious memory is not one straight line. It's a landscape of choices. Different communities decide what matters, what speaks, what must be kept. In Ethiopia's highlands, Jubilees never lost its authority, so it never needed to be rescued. It kept speaking while much of the world fell silent. Qumran and the return of a calendar gospel. Then, in the 20th century, the silence broke in another way. A shepherd's tossed stone, a crack in a cave, and suddenly jars began to surface from the cliffs near the Dead Sea manuscripts, sealed away for nearly 2 millennia. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just add footnotes to history. They reopened entire rooms that had been locked. And among the texts most closely associated with that desert community was Jubilees. At Qumran, Jubilees wasn't a quirky extra. It functioned like a structural beam. Multiple copies were found more than you would expect for a minor text, suggesting it was read, copied, circulated, and valued. The community, often linked with the Essenes, appears to have treated the solar calendar not as preference but as proof of legitimacy. Jerusalem's priesthood, in their view, had corrupted worship by corrupting time. If the temple kept feasts on the wrong days, then the temple, no matter how grand, was out of step with heaven. So the calendar became identity. A community that felt exiled from the nation's center built its life around a different clock. 52 perfect weeks, seasons divided with clean symmetry, festivals anchored to fixed days of the week. Time itself turned into a form of worship, because to keep the right time was to keep covenant with the angels, to sing in tune with heaven. Other Qumran writings echo the same atmosphere. A world divided between light and darkness, history moving according to an already written plan, angelic ranks participating in earthly events, a final restoration approaching like a scheduled dawn. Jubilees didn't create all those ideas by itself, but at Qumran it gave them a script and a spine. What the scrolls ultimately revealed is simple and enormous at once. Jubilees was not an obscure eccentricity. It was central for at least some ancient Jews. It shaped how they prayed, how they counted days, how they judged the legitimacy of institutions, how they imagined the war between divine order and human drift. In the desert, where stars appear almost painfully bright, they tried to live as if heaven's clock could still be heard clearly, if only you refused the noise of the world. The Scholars' Revolt, a book re-enters the modern mind. After centuries of silence in the West, Jubilees returned first as rumor, odd manuscripts brought from Ethiopia, unfamiliar titles mentioned by travelers, fragments of a lost tradition surfacing in places scholars didn't expect. At the beginning it was hard to classify. Was it ancient, medieval, Jewish, Christianized, a derivative retelling, or a window into an older world? That uncertainty became a spark. By the mid-19th century, European scholars began producing the first major modern translations from Ethiopian manuscripts, pulling Jubilees into academic debate and forcing a re-evaluation of how varied ancient Judaism really was. Then Qumran's discoveries added an entirely different kind of evidence. Older fragments, a desert context, and clear proof that this wasn't merely a late curiosity. It was part of a living argument about time, law, angels, and covenant. And suddenly, the book that claimed to reveal history's hidden clock was doing something it had always promised to do. It was changing how people read the beginning. Every new translation, Latin, English, French, German, and beyond, did more than move Jubilees into another language. It moved the book into a new set of assumptions. Each era of readers brought different questions to the same pages, and the text kept answering in ways no one expected. One question rose to the top immediately. When was this written? Jubilees introduces itself with audacious authority. It claims to be revelation, angelic instruction delivered to Moses, a hidden companion to the Torah that restores what history forgot. But the more carefully scholars listened to its voice, the harder it became to accept that self-description at face value, not because the book lacked power, but because its fingerprints seemed to belong to a later world. Clues were everywhere once you knew how to look. The language carried patterns that fit later Hebrew and related traditions better than the biblical style it imitated. The theology felt shaped by debates that only make sense in the centuries after the exile, arguments about calendars, priestly legitimacy, purity, boundaries, and identity under foreign rule. Even the way Jubilees organizes time, its relentless structure, its obsession with fixed cycles, felt less like an ancient desert memory and more like a pointed response to real disputes. Dating it became a kind of detective work. Scholars compared vocabulary choices, rhetorical habits, narrative expansions, and the book's assumptions about law and angels with other writings from the Second Temple period. Slowly, a rough consensus emerged. By the early 20th century, many researchers placed the book somewhere around the 2nd century BCE, during the turbulent decades when Jewish society was deciding what faithfulness would mean under pressure. That timing mattered. It dropped Jubilees right into a moment of cultural collision. Greek influence had reshaped cities, education, politics, and worship. The Maccabean crisis and its aftermath had not simply produced military conflict. It had produced competing blueprints for Jewish life. Different groups weren't merely arguing about details. They were arguing about the soul of the covenant. What counts as legitimate worship? Who has authority? What calendar is heaven actually honoring? What boundaries keep a people from dissolving into the world around them? In that atmosphere, Jubilees reads less like a quaint retelling of Genesis and more like a manifesto disguised as sacred history. Its strictness isn't accidental. Its precision isn't a personality trait. It's a strategy. The book tells the oldest stories again in order to win a present argument. The covenant has a rhythm, and if you change the rhythm, you lose the covenant. 1947. The desert answers back. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1947, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls forced the modern world to rethink what it thought it knew about early Judaism. Those jars in those caves didn't just preserve old parchment, they preserved evidence that entire streams of Jewish thought had once been vibrant, organized, and confident only to vanish later from the forms of Judaism most people inherited. And Jubilees was suddenly there, not as a rumor, but as a recurring presence. Multiple copies and fragments found near Qumran meant scholars could no longer treat Jubilees as an odd late invention or a medieval curiosity. It had real antiquity. It had circulation. It had authority, at least for some communities. Scientific testing on scroll materials and comparative dating of the manuscripts pushed the evidence backward and anchored it in the Second Temple era in a way that reshaped the debate overnight. Just as important, Qumran didn't preserve Jubilees as a side interest. The community's writings show a worldview where timekeeping itself was spiritual allegiance, where the wrong calendar wasn't merely inconvenient but corrupting. In that context, Jubilees wasn't a footnote, it was a backbone. Its solar year and fixed festivals weren't trivia, they were identity. Suddenly, the scholarly questions multiplied instead of shrinking. If Jubilees was this early and this influential, then who wrote it and what world produced it? Proposals branched in multiple directions. Some scholars highlighted its priestly tone, its intense interest in purity, sacred space, ritual boundaries, and the logic of a temple-shaped universe. Others emphasized its apocalyptic edge, angelic intermediaries, cosmic conflict, predestined history, heavenly tablets, and invisible forces working behind visible events. Still others noticed how closely it threads law into daily life, as if the author wanted Torah to govern everything from the calendar down to the smallest habits. And beneath all of that lay a broader revolution in scholarship. For a long time, many outsiders read ancient Judaism backward, using later rabbinic tradition as the default template and treating everything else as a strange deviation. Jubilees helped shatter that oversimplified picture. It made it impossible to pretend there was only one Judaism moving in a straight line toward a single outcome. Instead, the Second Temple period looked like a landscape of competing voices, multiple groups claiming authenticity, multiple calendars claiming heaven's approval, multiple narratives trying to define the covenant's true shape. By the late 20th century, Jubilees had moved from forgotten to foundational in the study of Second Temple Judaism. Scholars held conferences focused entirely on it. Dissertations mapped its themes with surgical precision. New translations appeared regularly, each trying to capture its strange blend of biblical familiarity and radical difference. A work that once seemed like an eccentric retelling had become a key witness to the intellectual world that also produced early Christianity and later rabbinic consolidation. The pseudepigrapha question: forgery or ancient practice? One debate stayed especially hot: the question of pseudepigraphy texts written under the name of a revered figure from the past. Jubilees presents Moses as the receiver. It frames itself as revealed on Sinai. But scholars widely agree it was composed centuries after Moses. So what is it? Some dismiss this kind of writing as dishonest, a deliberate attempt to borrow authority by putting new ideas into an ancient mouth. Others argued that the ancient world didn't always treat authorship the way modern readers do. In certain religious settings, writing as a famous figure could be a recognized literary practice, a way of claiming continuity, not a way of hiding a signature. The goal wasn't to fool readers with a biography, it was to anchor a message in the sacred past, to say, this is what the covenant has always meant, even if you've forgotten. Whatever judgment scholars made about the ethics of the practice, the effect was undeniable. After centuries of silence in much of the world, Jubilees started speaking again. Its fixation on time, order, and boundary, once mocked as obsessive, began to look like a coherent spiritual vision shaped by real historical pressure. Modern readers, in turn, became more nuanced. Jubilees wasn't weird because it was misguided. It was intense because it was fighting for survival, fighting for a way of being Jewish that could resist assimilation, withstand corruption, and remain aligned with heaven's schedule in a world that kept trying to reset the clock. And in recovering Jubilees, scholarship didn't just recover a text, it recovered a lost world. Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, two voices from the same hidden corridor. Deep inside Jubilees, another book shadow keeps appearing, the Book of Enoch. These two writings share a family resemblance so strong it's hard to miss. Both speak fluently in the language of angels and cosmic administration. Both treat history as structured from above. Both rely on the idea of heavenly records, tablets, books, decrees, where the shape of reality is written before reality plays out. And both expand brief biblical hints into elaborate narratives that transform how the early chapters of Genesis feel. In Genesis, Enoch is almost a blink, a man who walked with God, and then he was gone. Enoch literature turns that blink into a journey through the architecture of heaven. Jubilees takes that expanded Enoch and gives him a central function: timekeeper, scribe, astronomer, priest, the human who learns to read the sky correctly and record sacred rhythms for the earth. Both books also expand the Watcher's tradition, angels assigned to watch humanity who abandon their posts, cross forbidden boundaries, and unleash chaos through violence and forbidden instruction. Genesis hints at something like this. Enoch and Jubilees place it near the center of the flood story. The flood, in their shared imagination, isn't only punishment for ordinary human evil. It's a cosmic cleanup after an angelic violation destabilizes the world. They overlap in other ways too. The idea that certain beings teach forbidden arts, weapon-making, enchantments, destructive knowledge delivered without wisdom. The presence of a prosecutorial adversary figure, Mastema, in Jubilees, and Satangent-like functions in related traditions, who accuses, tests, and tries to bend human history toward failure. And above all, the shared conviction that time is not neutral. Time is sacred structure. If you misread it, you mislive. Scholars sometimes use labels like Enochic to describe this broader stream of thought, a worldview marked by cosmic dualism, angelic revelation, astronomical obsession, and a strong sense that history is written before it unfolds. It doesn't neatly match the Judaism that later became dominant after 70 CE, where the Torah's authority consolidates, and Revelation is framed more tightly around Moses and authorized interpretation. In this older stream, Moses is vital, but he isn't alone. Enoch is also a revealer. Heaven discloses secrets through multiple channels. That difference helps explain why both Jubilees and Enoch eventually felt uncomfortable to emerging orthodoxies, Jewish and Christian. Their angelology is expansive. Their determinism can feel heavy. Their willingness to claim revelation beyond the Torah's familiar frame challenges leaders trying to define boundaries of acceptable belief. So the books drift to the edges, preserved in places like Ethiopia and in desert caves. While their ideas continue to echo indirectly through later mysticism, apocalyptic movements, and folklore about angels and demons. Reading them together today doesn't just add trivia to Genesis. It opens a window into a time when Jewish thought was far more diverse than later textbooks suggest, when multiple communities competed to define what faithfulness meant, and when the sky itself was treated like scripture. Jubilees and the Gospels, echoes without quotations. And that brings us to an intriguing final bridge. When the first followers of Jesus began writing down his story, they weren't building in a vacuum. They were writing from within a Jewish world crowded with texts, traditions, interpretive habits, and competing visions of how God acts in history. The Gospel writers never directly quote Jubilees, and they don't need to for resonance to exist. Because you can feel the shared atmosphere in places, heightened awareness of angelic activity, the sense that history is moving toward appointed fulfillment, the idea that sacred time matters, the framing of present events as the climax of patterns laid down long ago. Even when the Gospels don't borrow lines, they often breathe the same Second Temple air, an air in which books like Jubilees helped shape how people imagined divine plans unfolding on schedule. These echoes don't prove the Gospel writers had a copy of Jubilees on their desks. They point to something more interesting. Jubilees and the Gospels grew out of overlapping currents of Jewish thought that were still moving strongly in the first century, currents obsessed with sacred time, angelic mediation, cosmic testing, and the conviction that history isn't a random walk, but a guided unfolding. Look at how Matthew opens his story. He doesn't begin with a miracle or a sermon. He begins with a genealogy carefully shaped, deliberately arranged, and broken into patterned blocks. It's not just ancestry, it's architecture. Matthew is telling you, before Jesus speaks a word, that the story has structure, that generations can be counted like steps, that the past contains design. That instinct feels very close to the world of Jubilees, where chronology isn't background scenery but part of the message, where events don't merely occur, they arrive on time, as if heaven had already placed them on a schedule. Luke leans into another shared atmosphere, the nearness of the unseen world. His opening chapters are crowded with messengers. Angels appear not as distant symbols, but as active participants, announcing births, interpreting meaning, protecting the vulnerable, steering human decisions at turning points. In Luke, the boundary between heaven and earth is thin, precisely when the story demands it to be thin. That fits the emotional logic of Jubilees, where angels aren't occasional visitors but constant administrators, watchers, scribes, envoys recording, guiding, and sometimes restraining destructive forces. The temptation stories in Matthew and Luke sharpen the parallel further. Jesus is driven into the wilderness to face the tempter, the adversary who offers shortcuts, distortions, and misdirection. The Gospels call him Satan. Jubilees prefers Mastema, a prosecutor-like figure who tests and accuses. The names differ, but the vibe is strikingly similar. Faithfulness is proven under pressure, and the pressure is not just internal psychology. It comes with a voice, a strategy, a challenger who knows how to twist hunger into impatience and impatience into betrayal. In both worlds, temptation isn't merely being bad. It's being pulled out of alignment, out of obedience, out of trust, out of the intended path. John's opening takes the shared beginning obsession and tilts it cosmic. His prologue speaks of the Word, the Logos, existing before creation and acting as the agent through whom all things come into being. That language clearly converses with Greek thought, but it also overlaps a Jewish impulse you can feel in Jubilees, the desire to look behind Genesis' curtain, to ask what was in motion before the first day, what existed before dust and rivers and names. Jubilees imagines heavenly tablets, angelic ranks, a pre-written order. John imagines a pre-existent word, different frameworks, same instinct. Creation has depth, and the deepest layer is not chaos but intention. Now place Jesus' Sabbath disputes beside Jubilees' intense Sabbath logic, and you can almost hear the earlier arguments humming beneath the gospel scenes. When Jesus insists the Sabbath is for humanity rather than humanity for the Sabbath, he isn't speaking into a vacuum. He's speaking into a Jewish world already wrestling with what strictness means, what boundaries protect, what boundaries suffocate, and how sacred time should shape ordinary life. Jubilees represents one extreme end of that spectrum. Sabbath as cosmic alignment, as angelic rhythm, as a fixed and non-negotiable pillar of reality. The Gospels don't mirror that strictness, but they absolutely share the assumption that the Sabbath debate is serious, because time itself is serious. The same is true of festivals. The Gospels repeatedly place major moments inside the calendar: Passover, tabernacles, dedication events, framed not only as cultural settings, but as loaded times when meaning intensifies. John especially seems to think when matters. Scenes are staged on feast days like a theater director, choosing the most charged date for the most charged line. That sensitivity to sacred timing feels like the broader Second Temple atmosphere. Jubilees also breathes an atmosphere where holy days aren't merely anniversaries but portals, moments that carry a particular kind of spiritual weight. Even the Gospel's constant language of fulfillment resonates with the older idea so central in Jubilees, that history is the unfolding of what has already been written above. Jubilees expresses that through heavenly tablets and fixed cycles, the Gospels express it through Scripture, fulfilled in real time. The emphasis differs. Gospel writers often spotlight human response more dramatically, but both share the confidence that events aren't accidental, that meaning isn't improvised, that the story is bending toward a purpose. So the point isn't secret borrowing. The point is shared air. These texts emerged from a world where ideas traveled, overlapped, mutated, and crossed boundaries. Communities argued, traded stories, reinterpreted old traditions, and sometimes fought over calendars and purity and angels and authority. The Gospels are not a clean break from Jewish tradition. They are a bold recentering of Jewish tradition around Jesus. Jubilees helps you see how wide and lively that tradition already was, and how many ways people were trying to explain God's plan before and during the first century. At the deepest level, what links Jubilees and the Gospels isn't a list of matching details. It's a shared refusal to treat history as noise. Both imagine time as meaningful. Both assume heaven is involved. Both trust that behind the visible chaos there is a pattern drawn by the same hand that placed lights in the sky and set days in motion. Jubilees in the modern world. Why rigid time still attracts people. And that's where the story takes a surprising turn. Because Jubilees isn't only a relic scholars argue about. In some modern corners, it has become a living text again. It tends to attract people who feel overwhelmed by drift, moral drift, cultural drift, spiritual drift. People who look at modern life and see a world that changes too fast and explains too little. For them, Jubilees doesn't read like extra rules. It reads like solid ground. Its voice is blunt. Its boundaries are clear. Its timeline is firm. In a culture where everything feels negotiable, Jubilees feels unshakable. The precision is the hook. Dates, cycles. A calendar that claims to be heaven's own measurement rather than human compromise. Some groups rebuild their rhythm around a solar count they believe restores God's intended order. They mark weeks in clean sequences, measure seasons with near-ritual attention, and treat mainstream calendars as layers of confusion that keep people out of sync with sacred reality. That doesn't always mean they withdraw from society. Sometimes it looks quiet from the outside. Someone with a normal job who celebrates holy days on different dates than their neighbors. A family that quietly avoids certain practices during certain periods. A small circle that treats the sky not as scenery, but as signal. But for those living it, the internal experience can feel enormous. Daily life becomes charged, because every day has a place, and every place has meaning. The warnings in Jubilees can become especially powerful to such communities. The book doesn't just offer order, it warns about what happens when order is abandoned. It describes confusion as spiritual vulnerability. It portrays mistimed worship as a door left open. If you already feel the modern world is chaotic, that language can feel less like ancient paranoia and more like accurate diagnosis. Of course, critics raise real concerns. A text that promises certainty can become a tool for control, especially if leaders claim exclusive knowledge of God's timetable. Rigid calendars can slide into rigid communities. Predictions about end times dates can cause harm when they fail. A hunger for order can become fear dressed up as righteousness. That's the risk of any system that treats timing as ultimate proof. The calendar becomes not a guide, but a weapon. And yet, many people drawn to Jubilees aren't chasing doom. They're chasing meaning. They describe a strange peace in having a rhythm bigger than mood, bigger than politics, bigger than personal chaos. They talk about feeling located, as if their lives aren't floating anymore. Even ordinary acts like eating, resting, and celebrating become significant when they're linked to a cosmic pattern. What's driving this renewed interest isn't only religion. It's a human need, the longing to believe that life isn't random, that time isn't empty, that the world has a pulse you can learn to feel. The God who keeps time. If Genesis shows God creating with speech, Jubilees shows God creating with schedule. In Genesis, a word splits light from darkness. In Jubilees, the same creative authority seems to set appointments. Creation is not only brought into existence, it's arranged day by day, measure by measure, with a sense that time itself is one of the first sacred inventions. Animals, plants, humans, all enter the story as if stepping onto a stage at the moment their cue was always going to arrive. That's why the heavenly tablets matter so much in Jubilees. They're mentioned again and again because they represent more than destiny, they represent timed destiny. Not only what will happen, but when it will happen. The universe isn't portrayed as a machine God winds up and abandons. It's portrayed as a world God continues to govern through order, through rhythms that can be honored or violated. And the surprising thing is, Jubilees doesn't treat that precision as cold, it treats it as care. A God who counts days is a God who pays attention. A God who assigns seasons is a God who refuses chaos, the final word. In Jubilees, the point of sacred timing isn't that humans must become obsessive. It's that humans are invited to live inside a meaning structure that existed before them and will outlast them. When they align with it, they participate in something that doesn't decay as quickly as their bodies do. Their lives become echoes of a pattern that death can't erase. That's the heart of the book's emotional power. The promise that time has shape, the claim that history has a script, the insistence that the Creator didn't just make the world he made, meaningful time as the world's rhythm. In a world where life could feel like a storm disease without warning, famine without explanation, empires rising and collapsing like waves, the vision in Jubilees landed like a steady hand on the shoulder. A God who keeps perfect time means nothing is meaningless. History isn't a roll of the dice, it moves with intention. Even pain has a place in the sequence, a season in the larger design, a mark on the timetable that doesn't erase the suffering but refuses to call it random. That's why the book's warnings about holy days feel so severe. Jubilees doesn't treat getting the date wrong as an innocent scheduling slip. It treats it as stepping out of the rhythm God built into creation, like walking off the path and into a landscape where the rules no longer protect you. The angelic voice thunders about those who change the days, not because God is petty about calendars, but because, in this worldview, time itself is covenant space. To follow a different calendar is to live by a different reality, one not aligned with the way God ordered the world. And yet the God who measures time so precisely is not a distant astronomer. He is close enough to walk in Eden, close enough to speak to Noah, to call Abraham, to meet Moses on the mountain. He makes promises that last longer than any human lifespan, and then stays involved as those promises unfold. Jubilees holds two forces together, intimacy and structure, closeness and law, like two hands shaping the same clay. The result is a God who loves, but loves with order. A God who draws near, but draws near with boundaries. That mix reaches into something deep in people. We don't only want freedom, we want meaning. We don't only want love, we want a world that isn't absurd. Jubilees offers that though it leans hard toward structure, it asks you to imagine living under a gaze that doesn't drift, waking each morning believing today is not another day, but this specific day, already counted, already known, already inscribed. For ancient believers, that could feel like comfort. Life gained weight, routines gained dignity. Ordinary moments became sacred because they were linked to heaven's own rhythm. And even now, people still find peace in structured time. The repeated call to prayer, the weekly Sabbath pause, the yearly cycle of feasts and fasts. Those patterns do something powerful. They rescue time from emptiness. They turn hours into something more than hours. The modern world often trains us to think of time as currency, something to spend, save, waste, optimize. We sprint through days as if the clock is an enemy. Jubilees offers a different posture. Time as gift, time as creation, time as revelation. The book's insistence is almost provocative. Your days are not disposable. They're meaningful. Not because you pack them with productivity, but because you can align them with something larger than yourself. And then Jubilees widens the frame even further. The angels are watching. Look up at the sky at night and Jubilees says, "You're not the only one looking." The stars aren't the whole story. Behind them stands a populated cosmos, orders of angels assigned to nations, elements, seasons, and human lives. Where Genesis gives you a few brief angelic appearances, Jubilees gives you a universe humming with spiritual administrators. Angels over fire, angels over wind, angels over cloud and darkness, snow and hail and frost down to thunder and lightning, as if every force in nature has a conscious steward. Nature, in this imagination, isn't a machine that runs on impersonal laws. It's a managed realm, not chaotic, not accidental directed. The world works because someone is keeping it working. And these beings don't only govern weather and seasons. They observe people. Deeds are recorded. Choices are witnessed. Nothing is truly unseen. Jubilees builds a kind of heavenly bureaucracy. Scribes, reports, tablets, ledgers, an unseen network that makes history feel supervised down to the smallest act. For the original readers, that had two effects at once. Comfort, because it means reality isn't out of control. Fear, because it means you're never fully unobserved. Even sin in secret has a witness. Even kindness unpraised is still counted. Some of these angels help. They guide, warn, protect. When Noah receives instructions, heaven supplies them. When Abraham turns from idols, he doesn't walk into that decision alone. Jubilees wants you to feel that the faithful are accompanied even when they think they aren't. But there are also opposing forces. Jubilees gives the adversary a clearer face than Genesis does. Mastema is not merely a vague shadow behind a serpent. He is an accuser, a tester, an organizer of temptation. He argues with God, seeks permission, pushes for trials, presses human weakness. The result is a spiritual landscape that feels less neutral. Humans aren't just making choices in an empty field. They're navigating a battleground where help and harm are both active. That naturally raises the question the book never fully settles. How free are we really? If angels record every step and darker powers look for every crack, how much agency is left? Jubilees answers indirectly by insisting that your choices matter precisely because they're witnessed. The record implies responsibility. The surveillance implies consequence. And yet, From a modern standpoint, the whole thing can feel eerily familiar. We live under cameras. Our clicks and movements become data. Profiles get built. Privacy gets thinner. Jubilees imagined a watched world long before technology made watching easy. That's why some interpreters read the angelic system as social control. If people believe invisible witnesses record everything, they behave even when human authorities aren't present. The angels become the ultimate enforcement mechanism, more effective than any police force, more constant than any courtroom. From that angle, Jubilees can look almost dystopian, a world where the script is already written and the watchers make sure you stay in your lane. But many believers experience the same vision in the opposite direction. The watchers don't only record failure, they record prayer. They don't only catch wrongdoing, they guard the vulnerable. They don't only witness tears, they ensure tears aren't wasted. In that reading, being seen isn't oppression, it's mercy. It means you're never forgotten. It means even your smallest act of faith has a witness in heaven. So the book leaves you with a question that doesn't have one universal answer. How do you feel about being seen? Does it soothe you, or does it tighten your chest? Does it feel like protection or intrusion? Jubilees doesn't let you remain neutral. Its universe is crowded, its sky is alive, its silence is never truly empty. Time is not just a clock, time is a test. In Jubilees, time doesn't merely pass, it evaluates. Each day becomes a crossroads. Will you align with heaven's rhythm or improvise your own? Will you honor the divine timetable or slide into the easier, more popular timekeeping of surrounding cultures? This isn't an abstract question for the book. It's the central pressure point. A full moon, in this mindset, isn't merely beautiful. It's dangerous, a temptation to follow lunar reckoning instead of the sun-based year the author calls God's design. That's why the manuscript sounds almost alarmed when it speaks about those who observe the moon and allow seasons to drift. For Jubilees, this isn't astronomy, it's loyalty, it's identity. It's covenant fidelity expressed in the simplest daily act, counting days the right way. Imagine living with that mindset, waking up and believing today has been fixed in heaven's tablets since before creation. That your faithfulness is not only what you do, but when you do it. That every Sabbath is a moment of alignment, every festival a moment where the veil grows thin if you stand in the right place at the right time. For some, that structure is stabilizing. It turns routine into meaning. It makes life feel connected to something eternal. For others, it risks turning faith into perfectionism, an endless exam where one miscount equals failure. Where is grace if every day is pass-fail? Jubilees doesn't fully soften its standards, but it does leave room for a complicated truth. The patriarchs in its stories fail and yet continue. People break rhythm and are called back. Time tests, but time also teaches. The same structure that judges can also guide. The same schedule that exposes misalignment can also provide a way home. And that tension, order versus frailty, destiny versus choice, comfort versus pressure, is part of why the book still feels psychologically sharp. It names something humans keep wrestling with, the desire for a world that makes sense, and the fear of being crushed by that sense-making. What if Jubilees is right, at least about the shape of time? So here we arrive at the quiet, reflective edge of the story. What if Jubilees isn't right in every detail, not in its harshness, not in its rigid calendar claims, not in all its judgments, but right in its core intuition? That time has shape, that history leans somewhere, that our days belong to patterns we didn't invent, but can learn to recognize. Modern science tells us the universe runs on laws. Gravity holds, light moves, seasons return. The cosmos isn't pure chaos. Jubilees dares to extend that logic into meaning. What if order isn't only physical but moral and spiritual too? What if events don't merely happen but fit? What if history is not a pile of moments, but a story with direction? That thought comforts people in troubled times. When suffering feels random, Jubilees whispers that it isn't pointless. When the world feels out of control, it insists there is a hand on the wheel even if we can't see the road. But the same comfort brings a hard question. If time runs on divine rails, what becomes of freedom? Jubilees keeps both truths in the same room without fully reconciling them. Humans choose, and yet the tablets already know. People resist, and yet the pattern still unfolds. The book tilts toward destiny, but it never erases responsibility. It leaves you with a paradox that many believers still live with today. Direction without determinism, purpose without micromanagement, a story authored by God that still includes real human decisions. And even if you don't accept its metaphysics, Jubilees still challenges a modern habit that quietly starves the soul. Treating time like junk, killing time, wasting time, spending time like it's disposable. Jubilees suggests another verb entirely: sanctifying time. Treating moments as weighty, not because you achieve more, but because you live more consciously, more aligned with what you believe matters. So maybe the final question isn't whether Jubilees got everything correct. Maybe the question is what it refuses to let us forget. That time is not nothing, that days are not empty, that seasons are not random, that our lives, brief as they are, can still belong to something larger. The sun will rise again tomorrow, continuing whatever rhythm you believe holds the world together. And when it does, Jubilees invites one simple pause, one honest glance at the sky and the ticking clock, and a thought that lingers longer than the day itself. What if our time is part of a story written deeper than we can see?